Tonight, you walk the silent halls of history, where crowns glittered in the dark and queens waited, unseen, for a world that never came. The night begins softly, like candlelight on silk. You stand in a long corridor of stone, the air cool and perfumed faintly with beeswax and something older. Perhaps lavender, perhaps loneliness. Beyond a window pane, rain taps at the glass, as though history itself is trying to be let in. You are in a palace that doesn't exist anymore. At least not as it once did. Its walls were torn down centuries ago, its portraits sold off to collectors, and its gardens paved into a modern city square where pigeons now parade instead of courtiers. But tonight, it's here again. The tapestries have been rehung, the torches glow, and somewhere behind a velvet curtain, a queen exhales in the dark. Before we meet her, a gentle warning. You probably won't make it through this night. Not because of danger, but because the rhythm of history has a habit of rocking people to sleep. And by the time we reach the third queen, your eyelids will betray you. So before that happens, quietly, tap the like button if only to prove you were here. Maybe even whisper your location in the comments, along with the time. I like to imagine you listening in Mumbai at 2 a.m., or Oslo at dawn, or beneath a blanket somewhere in the middle of nowhere, drifting through centuries. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You walk through the echoing halls, each step a soft percussion against the flagstone floor. The light flickers on gilded portraits, women in heavy gowns, painted into silence, their hands folded neatly, their expressions hovering somewhere between serenity and despair. And then you see her, Joanna of Castile. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. It's a dramatic nickname, isn't it? Perfect for a tragic queen. It makes for good theater, good gossip, and an easy explanation for what happens when a woman in power refuses to behave. But the truth is slower, heavier, and less convenient. Joanna was never meant to rule. She was the third child of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who sent Columbus across the sea. She was intelligent, fluent in Latin, and painfully aware of her own insignificance. The kind of awareness that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. She married Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, a man whose beauty seemed to make him allergic to commitment. He was golden-haired, smiling, and entirely untrustworthy. At first, their marriage was a fairy tale, the kind of story chroniclers loved to decorate with doves and harps. But fairy tales fade fast in royal courts. By the time Joanna arrived in Flanders, she was already the foreign wife, the inconvenient outsider. And when Philip began to stray, she didn't respond like a saint or a strategist. She responded like a human being. She cried. She confronted. She raged. She once locked herself in her chamber and refused to eat. Another time, she tore a rival's hair out by the roots. In any other century, they'd call it heartbreak. But in hers, it was called madness. Historians still debate whether Joanna truly lost her mind or simply lost her patience. Some say her grief consumed her. Others believe it was politics, the men around her slowly gaslighting her into silence. But tonight, she's not mad. She's just tired. You can almost see her there, leaning on a cold stone windowsill, her candle nearly burnt down, the rain outside tapping like a metronome. Her crown lies discarded on the table beside her, the metal dull with fingerprints. She mutters to herself in Spanish, a prayer or perhaps a curse. Her voice is low, barely audible. And somewhere, in the hallway behind you, her footsteps echo. You turn, but no one is there. The air is heavy with wax and memory. You realize this corridor might go on forever, each door opening to another life, another waiting queen. You pass a tapestry showing a hunt, a stag cornered by hounds, a lady looking away. Symbolism, of course. Medieval art was subtle that way. You smile faintly. Maybe the stag was just tired, you think? Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings. Slow, mournful, regal. You follow the sound until it fades into the night. And there she is again, another queen. But this one looks less tragic, more resigned. Her name is Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese queen who married Charles II of England, the so-called Merry Monarch. She brought tea to England, which is probably the single most influential beverage import in British history. You could say she fueled an empire one cup at a time. But what history forgets is that she spent most of her marriage waiting. Waiting for her husband to visit. Waiting for his mistresses to leave. Waiting for the rumors to fade. Catherine had no children, which, in a royal court, was as good as treason. She endured mockery in pamphlets, isolation in a foreign country, and a husband who preferred laughter to loyalty. Her one consolation? Tea. In her quiet rooms, she sipped it daily. Tiny porcelain cup, steady hands. Her ladies soon copied her, and from there a ritual was born. Historians like to say she introduced the custom of afternoon tea, which is ironic, really, because while the entire country was drinking to her health, she was silently fading into the background. Unloved, unnoticed, unthanked. You can almost hear her voice if you listen closely. "Drink up," she says softly, "and remember me in the steam." You raise an imaginary cup in her honor. The scent of tea fills the corridor, a warm, almost floral note amid the chill. The portraits flicker again. The candle burns lower, and the queens, silent, forgotten, waiting, keep their vigil. Outside, dawn threatens to break. But here, time does not move. You breathe slowly. You are halfway between waking and sleep, walking through the long shadow of power and patience. And the next door is already open. The next room smells faintly of parchment and dust, like an old library left to rest. You step inside. A faint glow filters through colored glass windows, amber, green, and blue, casting stripes across the floor like ribbons of thought. At a desk sits a queen with ink-stained fingers, Eleanor of Aquitaine. If Joanna was called mad and Catherine forgotten, Eleanor was simply too much. Too clever, too ambitious, too alive. Born in the 12th century, she was queen twice, first of France, then of England. A rare double act that most kings couldn't dream of pulling off. She joined the Second Crusade dressed in armor, leading her own retinue of ladies, which, to the chagrin of the clergy, turned the expedition into what one chronicler called a parade of sin. Eleanor spoke multiple languages, negotiated with kings, and raised children who would later rule empires. But what history remembers most is her ability to wait. She waited 12 years while her husband, Henry II, kept her under house arrest. She waited through wars, through betrayals, through age itself. And when freedom came, she didn't emerge bitter. She emerged wiser, sharper, like steel reforged in silence. You can almost see her writing a letter now, each line neat and firm, her handwriting the same strength she never apologized for. Outside her window, a falcon circles lazily. Somewhere in the distance, a lute plays. Historians still debate whether Eleanor truly loved Henry or merely tolerated him. Maybe both. Or maybe she loved the idea of partnership until reality turned it into a lesson. Her presence fills the room, not with noise, but with calm command. And for a strange, fleeting moment you realize something. All these queens, all these forgotten women, share the same expression. That small, knowing smile of someone who has learned that patience can be its own form of rebellion. The candle sputters. The ink dries. You step back into the corridor, your footsteps soft again. Remember the tapestry from before, the hunt, the stag, the lady who looked away? It's there again. Only this time the stag isn't cornered. It's gone. The forest is empty, peaceful. And maybe that's how history survives, not through conquest but through endurance. Through quiet figures who waited in the dark long enough for dawn to find them. The candlelight trembles as you move deeper down the corridor. The air feels older here, older than stone, older than sorrow. Carries the weight of stories too patient to die. You pause beside a half-open door. It creaks softly, like a sigh from the past. Inside, the light is dim, filtered through a curtain the color of wine left too long in a goblet. The air smells faintly of rosemary and linen. Here waits Berengaria of Navarre, the queen who loved a man who barely noticed. She was the wife of Richard the Lionheart, England's golden crusader king, the hero of ballads and myths. But in all those songs, her name is rarely sung. When Richard went to the Holy Land, Berengaria went with him. She crossed scorching deserts, endured sea storms, and watched cities crumble in fire. Yet she was barely acknowledged by her husband, who, according to more than one chronicler, preferred the company of soldiers and songs to that of his wife. They married in Cyprus. No feast, no grand celebration, just a quiet ceremony overshadowed by the clang of armor and the call to war. She spent much of her life alone. When Richard was captured and imprisoned, she prayed for him. When he returned and later died in battle, she mourned him. But she never remarried, never ruled, never demanded anything more. History calls her the Forgotten Queen. She outlived him by over 30 years. 30 years of widowhood, waiting in the quiet halls of Le Mans, tending gardens and accounts. Her only letters those pleading with the English crown to pay her the money she was owed. She was patient, dutiful, devout, and mostly ignored. You stand in her chamber now, beside a small wooden table where a rosary lies coiled like a sleeping serpent. A candle burns next to it, the wax pooling into a shape that almost resembles a tear. You can almost hear her voice, soft, resolute, a whisper against the turning of centuries. I was a queen, she might say, but mostly, I was waiting. Outside her window, rain has begun again. The sound is strangely comforting, steady, rhythmic, like breathing. You step closer to the window. The world outside looks dreamlike. A gray sky, the outline of hills, and in the distance, a village chimney releasing smoke that curls into the cold. There's an odd peace in her loneliness, a quiet kind of dignity, and you think perhaps the forgotten aren't really forgotten at all. They're just sleeping beneath history's louder stories, waiting for someone to remember. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock chimes faintly. Its sound reminds you of a heartbeat, slow, certain, and endless. You follow it because that's all you can do. The next room is brighter, warm. Gold spills from the walls in sunlight tones, and the air carries the scent of beeswax and crushed herbs. On a carved chair sits Margaret of Anjou, the woman who refused to be quiet. If Berengaria was patience made flesh, Margaret was the opposite. Fire, fury, and unrelenting will. She was queen consort to Henry VI of England, a man known for piety, gentleness, and the unfortunate habit of slipping into catatonic silence for months at a time. Not the ideal leadership quality during a civil war. When Henry faltered, Margaret stepped forward. She negotiated, commanded armies, and fought to keep her son's claim to the throne alive during the Wars of the Roses. Chroniclers painted her as a monster, the she-wolf of France, a title that sounds fierce now but in her own time was meant as an insult, a way to remind people that power in a woman was something unnatural. You imagine her standing by a window, crown heavy on her head, listening to the sound of battle outside, the thunder of hooves, the cry of banners snapping in the wind. She was not born cruel, only cornered. And when cornered, she learned how to bare her teeth. Historians still debate whether she fought for love of her husband or love of power. But the truth is simpler. She fought because she had to, because no one else would. Now, in this quiet afterlife of memory, she sits calmly, eyes half closed, as if she finally found rest. A faint smile touches her lips. "I wasn't the monster," she whispers. "I was just awake." A nearby tapestry ripples slightly in the breeze. The threads shimmer with scenes of war and peace, kings and pawns, crowns and graves. And through it all, her face is there, woven into the background, unblinking, unforgotten. You linger a moment longer before stepping back into the corridor. The air feels different now, charged, alive. Somewhere far off, you hear the faint laughter of servants, the clatter of a dropped tray, the sigh of an old door closing. History still alive, still restless. You smile. "You probably won't make it through this day," you murmur to no one in particular, and you keep walking. The corridor has grown colder. The stones beneath your feet feel damp, as though you've wandered underground. A faint drip echoes in the distance, steady, unhurried. This is the forgotten wing, the part of history that even historians forget. You turn a corner and find yourself facing a narrow door carved with a single symbol, a crown turned upside down. You push it open. Inside, the light is faint, filtered through a lattice window. Dust drifts like snow in the still air. Here waits Blanche of Castile, queen, mother, regent, and, above all, survivor. She ruled France not as a shadow, but as a force. When her husband Louis VIII died, she became regent for their son, Louis IX, who was still a child. In a time when men believed women unfit to rule, Blanche commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and held her kingdom together through rebellion and plague. Her methods were not gentle. She once imprisoned nobles who questioned her, excommunicated bishops who opposed her, and personally oversaw the defense of Paris against revolt. Yet she did it all without ever wearing the crown outright. History called her the true ruler of France, but only in footnotes. You picture her now, standing beside a map, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed on the horizon. There's a strange peace in her composure, the kind that comes from knowing you've done what needed to be done, even if no one thanks you for it. You notice a book open on her table. Its pages are blank. Perhaps it's a prayer book, or perhaps it's waiting for her story to finally be written. Scholars still debate whether Blanche's sternness alienated her children or forged them. Louis IX would become Saint Louis, the most devout of French kings. But he also inherited her unbending will, a mother's legacy, carved in iron. You step closer to the window. Outside, snow has begun to fall, soft, silent, and endless. The room glows faintly with reflected light, and for a moment, everything feels still. And then, behind you, you hear a quiet cough. You turn. Another figure stands in the doorway, a young queen, pale and uncertain, her gown the color of faded violets. Mary of Hungary, sister to Emperor Charles V. Widow, regent, patron of painters and poets. She ruled the Netherlands with efficiency, grace, and the kind of exhaustion only lifelong responsibility can bring. Her court was filled with artists, Titian, Erasmus, Clouet, each of them drawn to her quiet intelligence. Yet in her private letters, she wrote of loneliness, of duty that consumed joy. Power, she once wrote, is a dress that never fits. You glance at her now. She looks both regal and fragile, like glass warmed by candlelight. She walks slowly to Blanche's desk, picks up the blank book, and closes it gently. Two queens, 2 centuries apart, sharing a silence deeper than any alliance. You realize then that every story you've heard tonight, every name, every shadowed queen, was connected not by power, but by patience. the patience to endure invisibility. You bow your head slightly as if in apology. The candle flickers once, then steadies. And somewhere, far off, a new door opens. The corridor goes on. And so does history. The next corridor hums with a faint, low sound, a kind of memory in vibration. It feels like walking through a dream woven from candlelight and sighs. You trail your fingers along the cold stone wall. The chill travels up your arm, a whisper of centuries condensed into one quiet moment. At the end of the hall stands a pair of open doors. The hinges groan softly, like old bones stretching. Inside, gold catches the light. A mirror, a crown, 1,000 stitched pearls. But the air, surprisingly, feels lonely. Here, in this gilded hush, waits and of Bohemia, you might not recognize her name. She was the first wife of Richard II of England, the poet king, the dreamer monarch. She came to England in 1382, a Bohemian princess in a strange, damp country where the air always smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet wool. She was gentle, clever, and by all accounts endlessly patient. She and Richard married for politics but grew into something rarer, genuine affection. She read with him, rode beside him, calmed his rages. He called her my most dear lady and true companion. When she died of the plague in 1394, he destroyed the palace where she had last breathed, refusing to live there again. Her death unmoored him. Without her, Richard became the king history remembers, volatile, isolated, sliding into tyranny. You can almost see her now, seated at her writing desk, sunlight touching her veil. The window behind her opens onto a faintly frosted garden, where servants scatter seed for birds. There's an odd peace about her face, not the pride of queenship, but the quiet understanding that some people hold power not through crowns, but through gentleness. An obscure chronicler once wrote that she kept England in grace through her patience. It's a lovely idea, and probably true, but historians still debate whether her influence truly softened Richard, or if the legend was born from nostalgia, the kind that paints the dead kinder than they ever were. You hear a page turn, and looks up. She smiles faintly at you, as though you've just interrupted her halfway through a letter she'll never finish. You want to speak, but the silence here feels sacred. So you bow your head, and when you look up again, she's gone. In her place, the mirror reflects only you, tired, thoughtful, and, perhaps, a little sad for all the forgotten kindnesses of history. You step backward into the hall. The air changes again, feels heavier now, thick with incense and judgment. The torches flicker in defiance. Another door creaks open, and this time, the scent is unmistakable. Roses, beeswax, and something metallic beneath it. A woman stands by the window, her silhouette sharp, her gaze sharper. Isabella of France. They called her the she-wolf, though, again, history's nicknames for women say more about the chroniclers than the women themselves. She was the wife of Edward II of England, a man who loved his favorites more than his queen. The court seethed with jealousy and whispers, and Isabella endured it all, until she didn't. She fled to France, raised an army with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and returned to depose her husband. A queen overthrowing a king. An act so shocking that English chroniclers could only explain it through demonization. But she was no demon. She was simply tired of being ornamental. After the coup, she ruled as regent for her young son, Edward III, until he turned 16 and quietly removed her from power. She lived her later years in genteel isolation, her name forever tethered to infamy. You can see her here now, standing in a shaft of winter light, fingers brushing the fabric of a tapestry. Her expression is unreadable, half regret, half pride. She turns slightly toward you, her voice a whisper that almost sounds amused. "They called me Wolf," she says softly, "but they never noticed who taught me to bite. For a moment, the corridor feels too small to contain her. Then the light shifts, and she's gone, her perfume, rose and smoke, lingering in the air. You breathe it in. You feel something between admiration and sorrow. Maybe that's what all of this is. History's strange fragrance. Equal parts reverence, regret, and something sweet you can't name. A bell tolls in the distance. Low, slow, deliberate. You turn toward the sound, and the corridor opens into something wider. A cloister, a courtyard perhaps. In the moonlight, a pool reflects the stars. You walk toward it, and your reflection shimmers beside theirs. The queens have faded, but their voices remain, faint and familiar, like dreams you almost remember upon waking. The water ripples once, then stills, and a new voice speaks. This voice is different. Young, cautious, and bright with the uncertain confidence of someone who hasn't yet learned how much the world can take from her. You follow it through the archway, where ivy climbs the walls and the faint sound of laughter echoes from another time. Here sits Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, Queen of Scotland, mother to a dynasty. She's seated on a low stone bench, her gown an awkward blend of English stiffness and Scottish practicality. Around her, courtiers whisper in accents half familiar, half foreign. She's smiling politely, but her eyes are elsewhere. Northward, toward the hills and wind and whatever freedom lies beyond etiquette. Married to James IV of Scotland at 13, she was a peace offering between two uneasy kingdoms. He died at Flodden when she was barely 24, leaving her regent for their infant son. Then came the betrayals, the remarriage, the political chaos, the endless waiting between crises. One chronicler said she sought love and found governance, which is, in its way, a very Tudor kind of tragedy. You can imagine her writing letters by candlelight, her quill scratching across parchment, asking her brother in England for help he never truly sent. Her life was a long balancing act between affection and strategy. She wanted peace but learned that peace had to be negotiated in whispers and marriages. Historians still debate whether she was naive or shrewd, saint or schemer. Perhaps she was simply human, too emotional for politics, too political for love. In this moment, though, she's still young. Her laughter, light, unexpected, spills through the courtyard. You hear it bounce off the stone walls, a sound like glass beads rolling on a table. Then the laughter fades, replaced by wind. Always the wind. You look up. The clouds have drifted apart, and moonlight spills over the ivy. Somewhere an owl calls. You remember the corridor behind you, the queens who waited, the ones who burned, the ones who endured. You realize they all lived under the same law of invisibility, that their stories would survive only if someone else chose to tell them. And you walking centuries later through their echo, are that someone. A flicker catches your eye. In the pool nearby, the reflection of Margaret's face lingers longer than it should, smiling faintly. Then it fades into the stars. You exhale slowly. The air feels warmer now, lighter. The walls no longer press in. For the first time, you feel like you're walking upward, not deeper into history, but out of it. Still, before you go, another door appears at the edge of the courtyard. Its frame is carved with vines and tiny crowns. You hesitate, then you push it open, and step into another century. The door creaks as you open it, releasing a sigh of dust and candle smoke. A soft draft brushes past your cheek, carrying the faint perfume of old parchment and lavender. Two scents that have never quite left the corridors of power. You step through. The walls are lined with portraits, but not the kind that command attention. These are quiet paintings. Women sitting with hands folded, gazes averted, their crowns half hidden in shadow. They were queens, certainly, but forgotten ones. Their names faded like ink left in the sun. You pause before one portrait, pale paint cracked in thin veins across her face. Her name, barely legible beneath the frame, Catherine of Braganza. She looks calm, almost serene, but there's a stiffness to her pose, a stillness that feels more like endurance than peace. You're in the late 17th century now. The air smells faintly of wig powder, wet cobblestones, and oranges. The fruit Catherine brought to England and unwittingly made fashionable. She was a Portuguese princess, married to Charles II, the merry monarch, who filled his court with laughter, scandal, and mistresses. And Catherine, dutiful, pious, foreign, was expected to smile through it all. She brought tea-drinking to England, or so people say. That's her quiet, lasting rebellion. Not overthrowing kings or leading armies, but reshaping an empire's habits one sip at a time. Even in her misery, she created rituals of calm. Her eyes in the painting seem to meet yours. You sense something both tender and iron-hard beneath the lace and pearls. She endured humiliation publicly and heartbreak privately, yet never gave her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her falter. An obscure note in a letter written by her maid reads, "Her Majesty wept only once, and not again thereafter." You wonder if that's true. Historians still debate whether Catherine's composure was discipline or despair, whether she was truly devout or merely cornered by circumstance. You take a step back. Her gaze follows, and you realize some queens conquered lands, others conquered themselves. You move on. The next portrait glimmers faintly in the torchlight, and you find yourself looking into the knowing smile of Queen Christina of Sweden. She doesn't look like the others. Her pose is casual, her expression almost mischievous. There's a book in one hand, a glove in the other, and her head is turned as though someone has just told her a joke only she understands. Christina reigned in the 1600s, a scholar, philosopher, and occasional scandal in human form. She refused to marry, abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and traveled across Europe with the self-assurance of a woman who owed nothing to anyone. Her contemporaries called her eccentric, difficult, unladylike. She collected art, debated theology, and once allegedly shot a man who insulted her during an argument. She also loved books more than crowns. You can almost hear her voice now, sharp, amused, echoing through the empty corridor. "Ruling is tiresome," she says with a smirk, "but reading, that is divine." And you believe her. In this gallery of shadows and faded frames, Christina feels like a splash of color, a rebellion painted in gold and blue. The torchlight flickers. The portraits seem to shift slightly, as if gossiping about your presence. You imagine their whispers, the patient, the fiery, the lonely, the free. You keep walking, past Catherine's quiet endurance, past Christina's brilliance, until the hallway widens again into another space. Something warmer, brighter, humming faintly with distant harp music. And there, near the center of a marble floor, you see another figure. Not a painting this time. A woman, seated before a window of pale morning light, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Her name is Maria Theresa of Austria, the empress who ruled an empire, bore 16 children, and still found time to manage taxes, wars, and court gossip. She doesn't look tired, though perhaps she should. Her eyes carry the weight of too many decisions, but also the calm of someone who has learned to live with responsibility like a second skin. Her court was famous for its formality. Powdered wigs, gilded carriages, precise etiquette. But behind that stiff decorum was a woman constantly rewriting what it meant to be powerful. Maria Theresa was not supposed to rule, laws forbade it. But when her father died without a male heir, she took the throne anyway. Armies rose against her. Ministers doubted her. She ruled for 40 years. There's a letter she wrote to her daughter where she admits, "Sometimes I am weary of being both father and mother to an empire." You can hear the quiet exhaustion in those words. But here, in this tranquil moment, she simply breathes. You realize something. For all her triumphs, for all her control, even Maria Theresa had moments of stillness like this. Little pockets of silence between wars and audiences, when she could just be a woman looking out a window at the snow falling on Vienna. You linger there too, watching the faint flakes drift beyond the glass. The air hums with history's exhale. And for a moment everything, the portraits, the marble, the silence, feels like a lullaby for all the women who never got to rest while alive. You wake, metaphorically, in another age, if wake is the right word for the kind of drifting history invites. The scent is sharper now. Vinegar, candle soot, and parchment. The smell of revolution. You're standing in a room lined with papers, pamphlets, maps. A quill lies discarded, ink pooling like a tiny shadow. A woman stands beside it, reading a letter aloud to herself. Her voice trembles, not with fear, but with conviction. Marie Antoinette, once the symbol of excess, now the icon of tragedy. History remembers her for the cake line she never said. But here, in the quiet, she is stripped of jewels and ceremony. Her dress is plain. Her hair, once piled high with powder and ribbons, falls simply over her shoulders. Her hands, folded together, are steady. You watch as she breathes in the cold air seeping through the window cracks. Paris outside hums with unrest, a heartbeat quickening toward catastrophe. It's strange to see her like this. Not the myth, not the martyr, just a woman aware that the world she knew has ended. There's something heartbreaking about how ordinary she looks. One forgotten maid wrote that the Queen was most kind when she was most alone. That seems right. You wonder whether she regretted her earlier life. The parties, the jewels, the endless masks. Historians still debate whether she ever truly understood the suffering of her people. But here, in this room, she's not a villain or a saint. She's a person rehearsing her final courage. Outside, someone shouts. The sound rattles the panes. Marie looks toward it, then back at the paper. She exhales. You notice the smallest thing, her hands stop trembling. Sometimes history's most powerful moments aren't declarations. They're the tiny silences before them. A bell tolls somewhere, echoing faintly from an unseen cathedral. The air thickens, turns gray, then slowly lightens again. And through that soft shifting haze, another figure takes shape. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Queen to George III of England, the Mad King as he's remembered. She's older now, her face etched with worry and patience. While her husband's mind unraveled, she kept the kingdom intact, raising 15 children and maintaining a calm so practiced it almost looks divine. One visitor wrote, "She smiled like one who had forgotten what joy was for. Still she endured. She loved botany, kept gardens full of rare plants, and sponsored artists and scientists. Her letters reveal a woman curious about the world even when her own world was crumbling." Historians still argue over her ancestry. Some evidence suggests she descended from a black Portuguese noble line. Whether true or not, it adds another layer to her already complex identity. A queen both revered and restrained by her time. You can almost see her now, walking through her gardens, touching the petals of a rose, whispering its Latin name to herself. Her dress rustles softly. She hums a hymn, and when she looks at you, you understand. Survival can be quiet, too. The wind picks up again. You follow her through the mist, back toward the corridor that has carried you across centuries. It feels endless now, a dream stitched from the size of queens. Some loved, some ruled, some waited, some broke. But all of them, in their own strange way, linger here in the hush between stories. Women who shaped history not with armies, but with endurance. You walk until your steps fade into silence. And once again, The whisper returns. Remember them. The torches dim. The air settles. You reach another door. Dark wood, carved with faint initials you can't quite read. And as your hand touches it, the story breathes in again, ready for whoever waits on the other side. The door opens with a sound like memory itself, soft, hesitant, a creak that's half sigh, half whisper. You step into a chamber lit by nothing but candlelight. The air feels warmer here, almost forgiving. Draped fabric lines the walls, pale blue and gold, and the faint scent of honey and dust lingers in the folds. At the far end of the room, a woman writes at a small desk. You can't see her face at first, only her hands moving steadily across parchment. Her handwriting is meticulous, each loop and line precise, like a queen who's spent her whole life learning control. When she finally looks up, you know her. And of Brittany, she blinks, and the candlelight catches in her eyes like tears that never fall. Twice crowned Queen of France, twice widowed, twice bound to the duties of alliance. Her marriages were treaties disguised as vows, her womb a battlefield for diplomacy. Yet here she is, writing a letter, her quill scratching steadily against time itself. Outside, the faint echo of bells from the cathedral reminds you of how closely her life was tied to the pulse of kingdoms. Anne's world is quiet now. She has ruled, negotiated, given birth 14 times, buried children, and prayed for peace that never quite came. And yet, beneath the weight of her sorrow, she rebuilt cities, reformed education for girls, and commissioned manuscripts so beautiful they still glimmer today in the soft hush of museums. There's an obscure record of her fondness for books bound in blue velvet, their clasps shaped like fleur-de-lis. One, legend says, was inscribed with a single line in her own hand. All things fall to dust, save knowledge and grace. You imagine her smile as she wrote it. Faint, tired, but proud. Historians still debate whether she truly loved either of her husbands or simply learned to live within duty's narrow walls. You feel that contradiction in the room itself, the warmth of the candles against the chill of the marble floor. She looks at you for a moment, quill still in hand, as if deciding whether to say something. Then softly she does. History, she murmurs, remembers kings for what they took, but queens are remembered for what they endured. You don't reply. There's nothing to say that wouldn't sound too modern, too awake. Instead, you bow your head slightly, as though the silence between you is the real act of reverence. The candles flicker, and the scene begins to blur, as though the ink on her page is still wet, still writing itself into history's margins. When the light fades, it reveals another space. A colder, grander hall lined with dark oak and velvet banners. At the center sits Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now there's a woman who needs no introduction. Her presence hums with confidence, even centuries later. You can feel it in the tilt of her chin, the measured grace of her hands. She's no shadowy queen waiting in corridors. She's the storm walking through them. Twice a queen, of France and then of England, Eleanor was mother to kings, crusaders, and chaos itself. She traveled across Europe, rode with soldiers, ruled in her husband's absence, and once imprisoned for years for daring to challenge him. Yet even then, she never truly lost. You watch her now, arranging a tapestry, the threads glinting gold in the lamplight. It depicts not war or saints, but vines curling endlessly, growth winding around constraint. She notices you watching. Still awake? She says, with a hint of amusement. You probably won't make it through this day either. The faintest smirk crosses her lips, and suddenly, she feels less like a historical figure and more like someone you might meet in a dream. Regal, self-assured, slightly amused by the idea that you think you can keep up. A cat slinks across the floor, its tail twitching as it disappears into the shadows. Eleanor watches it go. Freedom, she says, is the one luxury they never learned how to tax. You smile because even centuries later, she's right. The flicker of the fire catches her wedding ring. Simple, unadorned gold, worn thin by years. A symbol of politics disguised as love. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's power came from her charisma or her sheer stubborn will. Probably both. You linger there, half listening as she hums softly. A tune that might once have been a troubadour's song. It's strange how peaceful she looks, given the wars, betrayals, and imprisonments that filled her life. But maybe that's the trick to being remembered. Knowing when to rest between battles. When you turn to leave, she doesn't stop you. She only says, "Tell them we were not all waiting." And with that, the room folds back into silence. The corridor narrows again, as if history itself is drawing you deeper, compressing time into the hush of footsteps. You follow the faint glow of light until it opens into another chamber, smaller, humbler, filled with the scent of pressed flowers and parchment. Here, the walls aren't painted with glory. They're lined with letters, thousands of them, pinned up like ivy, curling with age. You touch one. The ink is faded, but the name is clear, Joanna of Castile. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But standing here, surrounded by her words, you sense something else entirely. She wasn't mad, at least not in the way history likes to label inconvenient women. She was a scholar, a polyglot, a woman whose intellect frightened her courtiers and whose grief made her human. Her story is strange and tragic. Married to Philip the Handsome, a name that promised too much. She loved him fiercely, dangerously, and when he died young, her sorrow consumed her. Legends say she traveled with his coffin for years, refusing to let it go. But historians still debate whether she truly lost her mind or was simply silenced by those who stood to gain from it. You imagine her here, surrounded by her letters, still writing, each word an anchor against the storm of rumor. Madness, she whispers from somewhere behind you, is what they call women who remember too much. The room feels colder now. You turn, and there she is, pale, calm, eyes wide but steady. She's not wild or broken, just tired. She gestures toward one of the letters on the wall. You lean closer and read, "Love outlives reason." Maybe that was her truth all along. The candles flicker. A draft curls through the room like a sigh. And then, from somewhere beyond the candlelight, a soft laugh rises. Low, melodic, entirely unexpected. It belongs to Marguerite of Navarre, sister to Francis I of France, writer, patron, and quiet revolutionary. She steps into view, her presence carrying that rare mix of intellect and ease that makes people forget to breathe for a moment. She's holding a book, the Heptameron, her collection of stories, written in the cadence of laughter and longing. Marguerite believed in compassion more than doctrine, love more than law. She debated theologians, sheltered reformers, and wrote with the kind of wit that still feels modern. "Tell me," she says, her tone light but teasing, "do people still fear clever women in your century?" You hesitate, then nod. She chuckles softly. "Ah, so not much has changed." There's warmth in her smile, one that glows through the candlelight like the first crack of dawn. "Do you know," she continues, "I once wrote that women must be patient like saints and dangerous like poets. But really, the secret is to be both. You think of all the women you've met so far, the saints, the poets, the patient, the dangerous, queens whose crowns weighed heavier than they looked. And you realize how perfectly they all fit into Marguerite's quiet wisdom." Page turns. The light shifts. You hear her voice one last time, gentle and certain. "Don't pity us. Just remember us." Then she steps back into the shadowed glow, her silhouette fading like ink washed by rain. The letters on the walls flutter as though stirred by an unseen breath. And for a long, peaceful moment, the only sound left in the room is your own breathing. The kind of silence that holds you not empty, but full. The kind that invites sleep. The kind that whispers, "You're almost home." The silence between centuries feels soft now, almost like a quilt. You walk through it carefully, each step sinking into the hush like a footfall in snow. Somewhere in the dark, a harp string hums faintly, a single note echoing down time's long corridor. You follow it. The air changes. Warmer again, scented faintly of lavender and beeswax. The flicker of torchlight widens into a glow that spills across polished stone. You've entered a small chapel. Not grand, not gilded, just humble, quiet, and gently holy. And there, kneeling before the altar, is Isabella of France. Not the innocent child bride she was when married off to Edward II of England, but the woman history would later call the she-wolf of France. The name feels harsh in the hush of the chapel. She doesn't look like a predator. She looks like someone who's been told too many stories about herself and learned to use them as armor. Her hands are clasped loosely, her crown set aside beside her like something she's tired of wearing. The faint light paints her face in shades of gold and shadow. You watch her lips move soundlessly. Prayer, perhaps, or something closer to an apology. Outside these walls, her life was all fire. Betrayal, rebellion, the fall of a king. Inside, though, she is only a woman counting regrets like rosary beads. You remember one story, that she orchestrated her husband's overthrow with her lover, Roger Mortimer. Another that she later saw him executed. Historians still debate whether she was villain, victim, or simply tired of being underestimated. You move closer. Her eyes flick open, catching yours. "I waited," she says softly, her voice like paper turning. "And in waiting, I learned how to rule." The irony is gentle but sharp. You almost smile. From behind her, a candle sputters, then steadies. Its light catches on the edge of a sword mounted on the wall. A reminder that her prayers and her politics were never truly separate. You take a deep breath. The air smells of wax and iron. Somewhere, faintly, a bell tolls. When you look again, Isabella is gone. Only her crown remains on the stone floor, still warm, somehow, from her touch. You pick it up briefly. It's lighter than you expected. Then you set it down again. Because that's what this story is about. Setting things down. You turn toward the sound of the harp again. It leads you down another passage. Narrow, twisting, lined with fading frescoes of women holding lilies, scrolls, and stars. And at the end of it stands Eleanor of Provence. A gentler presence, but no less steady. Her face glows with the pale calm of someone who has weathered storms and learned to smile through them. She was queen to Henry III of England in the 13th century, a foreigner, again, in a court that never quite trusted her. Yet she loved poetry, filled her halls with troubadours, and taught her children to read and think deeply. One of them, Edward I, would grow into the hammer of the Scots, a detail that probably kept her up at night. There's a scroll in her hand now, tied with a green ribbon. She unties it slowly, unrolling the parchment. You can just make out the lines. A queen's heart must be wide enough to hold the whole kingdom, and yet still break in private. You exhale. That's the kind of sentence that stays. She glances at you, faintly amused. "It's easier to be remembered when you die dramatically," she says. "I chose to live quietly. History doesn't quite know what to do with that." A small laugh escapes you. Feels like she's been waiting centuries to make that joke. The air shifts again, carrying the scent of herbs, parchment, and a faint trace of rosewater. Eleanor smiles softly, tucks the scroll under her arm, and fades like candle smoke. You stand there a moment longer, surrounded by the hush she leaves behind. A peace earned, not given. And then, slowly, the world begins to turn once more. You find yourself outdoors now. The transition feels like breathing after a long pause. The night air is cool, threaded with the soft hum of crickets and the faintest scent of rain on old stone. You're standing in a courtyard illuminated by 100 flickering lanterns. Shadows sway across ivy-clad walls. The cobblestones glimmer faintly under the light, each one slick with evening dew. And sitting on a low bench near a well is Joan of Navarre. Not Joan of Arc, the one with the fire and the myth, but another Joan entirely. Wiser, warier, less known. Queen consort of England to Henry IV, she was accused of witchcraft in her later years, by her own stepson, no less. You watch as she tosses a pebble into the well. The ripples catch the lantern light and turn it into trembling gold. "I once healed the sick," she says softly, "and for that, they called me a witch." The words are neither bitter nor sad, just matter of fact, as though centuries have smoothed the sharp edges. Her gown is dark blue, embroidered with stars. She looks like someone who knows too much about silence. "Did you curse them back?" you ask, surprising yourself. She smiles faintly. "No, I prayed for them." It seemed crueler. You almost laugh. It's a dry sort of humor, the kind that lingers between faith and fatigue. Historians still debate whether her imprisonment was about witchcraft or politics. But looking at her now, you know the truth was simpler. People fear women who know how to survive. You notice a faint shimmer on the well's surface, reflections of other faces, other queens, as though the water itself remembers. Joan dips her fingers into it, and the ripples widen. "History," she murmurs, "is just a pond that never stops reflecting." You sit beside her. The night hums quietly around you. A lantern flickers, the ivy rustles, and in that small, sacred silence, you feel the centuries collapse into calm. Then, somewhere beyond the courtyard, a bell chimes again. 3 slow notes that sound like the start of another story. You rise. Joan nods once, approvingly, and fades like breath on glass. You walk toward the sound. It leads you through an archway draped in vines, out into another garden. One that smells of mint, sage, and smoke. At its center, under a pear tree, stands Isabella of Castile, the woman who helped shape the modern world, and yet somehow still feels like she belongs to an older one. Her hands rest lightly on a map spread across a table. The map looks familiar, though incomplete, its edges frayed, its oceans wide and uncertain. You recognize it. The map of the known world before Columbus set sail. She glances up at you. "Strange," she says. "How men get remembered for voyages that others pay for." Her tone is wry, almost amused. You suspect she's made this joke before. Her gaze softens as she traces a finger over the western sea. "I thought I was drawing borders," she admits. "I was really drawing consequences." The wind stirs her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of candle smoke and sea salt. Historians still debate whether Isabella's legacy was piety or power. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it was neither. What's clear is the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet knowledge that even those who reshape empires cannot control how they'll be remembered. She looks at you again. "If you ever tell this story," she says, "tell it slowly." "I will," you whisper. The garden rustles. The lanterns flicker. You can almost hear the distant crash of waves, the sound of ships setting sail into myth. And for a moment, as the stars above you shimmer like scattered coins, you realize every queen you've met tonight waited for something: power, peace, understanding, the right to simply be. Some got it. Most didn't. but all of them, in their own way, endured long enough to leave a whisper behind. And you followed those whispers all this way, through time, silence, and candlelight. You take a deep breath. The night feels alive around you, and somewhere, faintly, another door begins to open. The door creaks open. The sound is soft, like parchment folding. You step through, and the scent of ink and parchment wraps around you. Warm, earthy, slightly sour. The air feels close, like the inside of a library that has never once been emptied of breath. Candles tremble in iron sconces, their light spilling over shelves of scrolls. You're in a scriptorium now, a place where words were once copied slowly, letter by letter, as if the act itself was a form of devotion. And at one of the long tables, hunched over a page, is a woman dressed not in velvet or jewels, but in rough linen. Her veil slips down her shoulder as she leans closer to the parchment. The quill trembles slightly in her hand. She looks up. Her eyes are sharp, gray, alive. This is Hildegard of Bingen, the philosopher, mystic, composer, and theologian who, somehow, managed to do all those things while being politely dismissed by her male peers. "Ah," she says softly, not looking surprised to see you. Another pilgrim wandering through the ruins of memory. You smile. She doesn't, but her expression softens, as if she's amused by your attempt. She dips her quill again and continues writing, lines of Latin looping neatly across the page. The words aren't just prayers. They're visions, fire, sound, color. You feel dizzy for a moment, as though you're peering over the edge of something vast and wordless. She was the kind of woman who saw divine order in music, medicine, and the shape of the sky. And in an era that mistrusted women who saw too much, she simply kept seeing. One of her writings described the universe as a cosmic egg, radiant, breathing, infinite. Historians still debate whether she meant that literally or poetically, but it doesn't really matter. The metaphor feels alive here. Did you ever think your words would survive this long? You ask. Hildegard glances up, a smile ghosting across her face. Words are like seeds, she murmurs. You never know which ones will grow, or in whose garden. You want to write that down, but this story is already recording it. The candle beside her gutters. She steadies it with a hand. People say I was ahead of my time, she adds. But time is a cage of men's making. I was only paying attention. There's a faint irony there, gentle but unmistakable. You watch as she sets her quill aside and closes her eyes, humming something low and strange. A melody without rhythm or measure, yet still, somehow, perfectly complete. The air hums with it. The shelves seem to lean closer. And then, like mist, she fades, leaving behind only the faint scent of ink and sage. You stand there a while, letting the silence settle back into place. Somewhere far off, a clock strikes, a hollow sound that feels like a heartbeat. You follow it. It leads you down a corridor that opens into sunlight. And just like that, you're in a palace courtyard again. Not English this time. Not French. The architecture breathes the air of the Mediterranean. Arches, bright tiles, and shadows that shimmer like silk. And standing at the top of a staircase, her veil gleaming in the afternoon sun, is Blanche of Castile, Queen of France, mother of Louis IX. A woman whose calm was sharp enough to rule an empire when her husband died and her son was still too young to hold a scepter. She sees you and inclines her head, not in greeting, but acknowledgement, as if she's already aware you've been walking through her memory for a while. You came from Hildegard, she says softly. You nod. She was a woman who thought in spirals, Blanche murmurs. I ruled in straight lines. The tone is not boastful, just factual. Behind her, the courtyard fills with movement. Children at lessons, courtiers bowing, priests debating the finer points of grace. Blanche moves through them all like a river around stones. Never hurried, always certain. Her son, the future St. Louis, adored her. So did much of France. But she was also accused of being too controlling, too cold, too unwilling to let her son rule on his own. Historians still debate whether that was true, or simply what happens when a woman exercises power gracefully. "I made him a king," she says, her voice like marble. "They called it interference." She turns, and the sunlight catches on the small silver cross at her throat. "I prayed every night for France," she adds, "but never once for patience." You almost laugh, but you sense she wouldn't. There's no bitterness in her eyes, only fatigue, the kind that builds up in layers like old paint. You stand there with her a moment longer, watching as the palace around her begins to dissolve into dust and light. When it's gone, only her voice remains, soft and far away. "Remember, power isn't taken. It's endured." The courtyard fades completely, and in the hush that follows, you realize your own footsteps have begun to echo differently, softer, slower, as though the story itself is growing sleepier with you. The world reforms around you like watercolor spreading on parchment. You're in a dim hall now, lined with tapestries. The air smells faintly of dust and wine. Outside, thunder murmurs in the distance. A summer storm just beginning to gather its courage. The tapestry nearest you shows a hunt. Riders with spears, hounds chasing a stag through embroidered forests. But if you look closely, the stag's eyes are almost human. Someone stitched empathy into its thread. At the far end of the hall, a woman sits by the window, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass. Margaret of Denmark, you realize, Queen of Scotland, a quiet figure in history's margins, known mostly for her diplomacy, and for the chill that seemed to follow her everywhere. She turns when you approach. Her expression is mild, composed, but her eyes are startlingly direct. "They said I was cold," she murmurs. "Perhaps I was. It's difficult to be warm in a land where even kindness freezes." You can't tell whether she's speaking of weather or court politics. Probably both. Her marriage to James III was, by all accounts, complicated. Political necessity disguised as affection. One historical account claims she slept in a separate room for most of their marriage. Another suggests she often acted as a quiet mediator between feuding nobles. Historians still debate which version is true, or whether she simply did what was needed and left no trace. On the table beside her rests a single goblet, half filled with dark wine. You can smell its spice from here, cinnamon, clove, something sharp and sweet. She lifts it gently, holds it up to the light. "Do you know," she says softly, "that in some courts, queens were forbidden to drink without their husbands present, as though thirst were a form of rebellion?" You smile faintly. She notices. "Go on," she says. "Laugh." "I did." "And you do?" A soft exhale more than a laugh. The thunder rolls closer now, echoing through the window panes. Margaret doesn't flinch. Instead, she looks out into the rain and says, "We queens are always waiting. Waiting for peace. Waiting for suns. Waiting for the rain to stop." Her voice lowers, almost a whisper. "I waited so long. I became the silence between storms." The words drift through the air like a lullaby. The storm outside begins to ease, the thunder fading into a sigh. Margaret leans back in her chair, her eyes half closed, her features softening until she looks less like a queen and more like a woman finally resting. And as the candle beside her flickers low, she fades too, folding gently into shadow. You remain for a moment longer, the room's dim warmth pressing close. Outside, the rain has stopped completely. You walk toward the doorway, past the tapestries that seem to ripple faintly now, as if stirred by unseen hands. Each figure within them, the stag, the hunter, the queen, seems to watch you go. You glance back once, and the faintest shimmer of silver threads catches the candlelight, spelling something in Old Norse script. You can't read it, but you know what it means. Endure. Wait. Remember. You take a deep breath and step forward into the next story, the next century, the next sigh of history's long, sleepy breath. The floor creaks, the shadows stretch, and somewhere ahead, you can almost hear another woman's voice calling softly, patiently, from behind the veil of time. You open your eyes to dawn. Pale light presses through a filmy layer of mist, turning everything gold and soft-edged. The air smells faintly of damp wood and bread, freshly baked, if you follow your nose far enough. You're standing in a narrow courtyard, tucked between two wings of an early Renaissance palace. The stones under your feet are slick with dew. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell tolls once, the sound wobbling gently like a note half-sung. A woman in a dark blue gown walks slowly across the flagstones. Her veil trails like ink in water. When she glances up, you recognize her immediately, Isabella of Portugal, Duchess of Burgundy. Her beauty was famous, though what people rarely mention is that it wasn't a pretty sort of beauty. It was stately, distant, the kind that could silence an argument with a single look. Even now, she carries herself like someone who's used to listening more than speaking. "You look lost," she says quietly. Her accent lilts somewhere between Spanish warmth and Burgundian frost. "Always," you reply, and she almost smiles. She gestures toward the palace garden, where a few servants are shaking dew off the roses. "This is where I came every morning," she says, "before the day began shouting." You follow her along the gravel path. Bees hum softly between the leaves, and in the center of the garden stands a stone fountain. The water is still, reflecting the thin blush of sunrise. "My husband," she says finally, "was a man of wars and treaties. I was the pause between them." It's not bitterness, just a statement, as calm as the water she's staring into. Isabella ruled Burgundy as regent when her husband, Philip the Good, was away at war. She negotiated, wrote letters, balanced accounts, soothed noble tempers, all while pretending none of it was remarkable. "Historians still debate whether I enjoyed power," she adds, as if enjoyment were a requirement for competence. You can't help it, you laugh softly. She glances sideways, approving. "The truth," she says, lowering her voice, "is that women were always ruling something. A household, a convent, a court. We just didn't write it in the chronicles." The fountain ripples faintly as a breeze passes over it. For a moment, her reflection seems to blur into two, one serene, one shadowed. She notices your gaze and says, "Sometimes, when you stand between two worlds, the water remembers both." You look up and she's already walking away. Her figure dissolves slowly into the brightening mist until only the sound of her footsteps remains. A soft rhythm fading into the hum of bees. You breathe in the scent of the garden again. Lavender, sage, something faintly metallic, and continue. The path leads you through an arched door into a long, airy hall. Here, the air feels different, sharper, more official. You can hear quills scratching, the faint creak of leather bindings, the occasional cough of a clerk who has been awake too long. At the far end of the room sits another queen, though you wouldn't know it at first glance. Her gown is modest, her hands ink-stained, her expression deeply, tiredly alert. This is Margaret of Austria, Isabella's granddaughter, and one of the most capable rulers of her age. She was regent of the Netherlands in the early 1500s, a woman whose diplomatic letters outnumbered most men's battle orders. She negotiated treaties between Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, often while keeping her own counsel amused and mildly terrified. "Sit," she says, not looking up from her parchment. "You look as though you've walked too far through the archives." You obey. The chair creaks faintly under you. Her quill keeps moving as she talks. "They remember my marriages," she says, "but not my mind. Isn't that always the way?" Her first betrothal was at age 3 to the French Dauphin. Her second marriage, to John of Castile, made her briefly Queen of Spain before his death. She spent the rest of her life as a widow, ruling with precision and a kind of austere humor that frightened diplomats. "Historians say I was cold," she adds, "but really I was efficient. Warmth wastes time." You raise an eyebrow. She notices. "Oh, don't look at me like that," she says, finally glancing up. "I laughed plenty, just not when anyone was watching." There's a small, painted box beside her filled with delicate miniatures of her family. Tiny portraits of nieces, nephews, and cousins, most of whom she raised herself. One of them, a young boy with solemn eyes, will grow up to be Emperor Charles V. You wonder aloud if she ever missed being simply Margaret. She dips her quill again. "There is no simply in a woman's story," she murmurs. "Even our silences are elaborate." The candle near her hand flickers. For a moment, the shadows move across the wall like the turning pages of a very old book. And then, with the sound of a sigh that might belong to the wind, she and her ink and her letters fade, leaving only the faint scent of parchment and orange oil. You close your eyes. You could almost sleep here. But the corridor beyond calls, softly, insistently, like the next breath of history waiting to be spoken. When you open them again, the light is different, cooler, grayer. A sound reaches you first, the slow, rhythmic clang of waves against wood. You're standing on a ship's deck, sails billowing high above like pale clouds. The sea stretches out endlessly in every direction, smooth as silk except where the wind wrinkles it. A woman stands near the bow, her cloak whipping around her, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She doesn't wear a crown, though her posture suggests one invisible and unshakable. This is Margaret I of Denmark, founder of the Kalmar Union, a queen who united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her rule in the late 14th century. A feat so improbable that some chroniclers later described it as divine providence. You step closer, your boots clunking softly on the damp planks. She doesn't turn. "Careful," she says in a low voice. "The sea tests everyone." The wind cuts sharply across the deck, carrying the salt and weight of the north. You pull your cloak tighter. "They said I was a woman who ruled like a man," she continues. "But I didn't. I ruled like myself." The sails groan as the ship tilts slightly. You look down. The water is dark, endless, and faintly luminous under the gray sky. She finally turns to you, her eyes fierce and sea-colored. "When my husband died, they thought Denmark would fall. When my son died, they thought I would fall. I did not." Her tone isn't pride. It's endurance, shaped into a statement of fact. "Historians still debate whether I was ruthless," she adds. "They never ask if I was tired." You almost smile at that, but the wind steals your breath. She walks toward the rail, resting one hand on it, staring out over the waves. "The sea was my witness," she murmurs. "It remembers everything. The treaties, the storms, the bones of sailors who thought themselves braver than water." Somewhere behind her, a gull cries, a sharp, lonely sound that fades almost instantly. You ask what she remembers most from her reign. "The silence," she says softly. "The silence after a victory, when everyone waits to see if peace will hold." Her cloak snaps once in the wind, and then her form begins to dissolve into mist. For a moment you think she's gone, But then her voice comes again, distant and low. Remember, child, unity is always temporary, but the longing for it lasts forever. You breathe deeply, the scent of salt thick in your lungs, and close your eyes again. When you open them, the deck has vanished. The waves are gone. You're standing on cold stone once more. A corridor stretches ahead, lined with old banners that droop slightly in the still air. Somewhere ahead, faint footsteps echo. A new queen, a new story waiting quietly behind the next door. And you keep walking, the rhythm of the sea still in your bones, the whisper of Margaret's voice drifting like a lullaby. Endure. Wait. Remember. The corridor ahead feels narrower, like walking through a memory that has grown too small to contain itself. The air is laced with beeswax, parchment, and something faintly floral. You can almost hear whispers brushing the walls, as if the stones themselves remember conversations once held in confidence. At the end stands a tall oak door, carved with lilies and interlaced crowns. You push it gently, and it opens with a sigh, the sound of centuries releasing a secret. Inside, light filters through tall mullioned windows, catching the dust in slow spirals. It feels like stepping into a painting you've only ever seen described. A woman sits beside the window. Pale gold threads catch in her hair. Her gown is a muted tapestry of blue and silver, regal yet understated. Mary of Hungary, another of Margaret of Austria's nieces, and, like her aunt, a regent of the Netherlands. She ruled in her brother Charles V's name, and though her title was borrowed, her power was not. You approach quietly, but she speaks before you do. Sit, she says softly. You look as though you've been walking through ghosts. You obey, settling on the stone bench opposite her. Outside the window, the courtyard hums faintly with the clatter of carts and the chatter of distant voices. But here, in this quiet room, time seems to have folded itself neatly into stillness. She looks out over the garden, her profile as composed as a coin engraving. Do you know what it means, she asks, to rule for someone who will never thank you? You hesitate, unsure if she expects an answer. She continues before you can speak. It means you must find satisfaction in the doing, not the remembering. Mary's regency was marked by rebellion, reform, and fatigue. She oversaw armies, balanced impossible politics, and endured endless correspondence from her brother, always instructing, rarely praising. Historians, she says, still argue whether I was dutiful or defiant. I think I was simply practical. She gestures to the quills, the ledgers, the neat stacks of wax-sealed documents. Every letter I wrote, she continues, was an act of control. When I could not steer the world, I could at least organize it. There's a faint bitterness there, but beneath it, something like grace. On the far wall, you notice a painting. Mary hunting, bow in hand, her greyhound frozen mid-leap. You raise an eyebrow. You hunted. Her lips curve faintly. I ruled countries. Of course I hunted. A single laugh escapes you before you can stop it. She tilts her head slightly, amused. I see you find me funny. Just unexpectedly alive, you say. At that, she smiles for real. A small, sharp smile that transforms her face completely. Alive is the only rebellion they couldn't forbid us, she says. The bell in the courtyard strikes once, then twice, and as its echo fades, so does she. The light dims, and all that remains is the faint scent of lilacs and ink. You rise, exhaling slowly. Your legs feel heavier now, as if each queen leaves a fragment of her story tucked into your bones. As you step back into the corridor, a draft rushes past. A breath of air that feels like transition. Another door waits ahead, this one narrower, older. Its hinges squeal in protest as you open it, revealing a dim, vaulted room filled with candlelight. There, hunched over a large wooden table strewn with scrolls, sits Blanche of Castile. The candles around her burn unevenly, their wax pooling in slow rivulets. A faint scent of honey clings to the air. She doesn't look up right away. Her hand moves steadily across parchment, the scratch of her quill the only sound in the room. When she finally raises her head, her expression is patient and penetrating all at once. "You're late," she says simply. "I didn't know I was expected," you answer. "You always are," she replies. "This, then, is the queen who ruled France in the name of her son, Louis IX. Blanche governed with poise and precision, turning a kingdom teetering on unrest into one admired across Europe. She was both adored and feared, a contradiction that suited her perfectly. I was called pious," she says, "but I preferred the word prepared." You study her face, lined, but not with regret. "Did you ever wish you'd been born a man?" you ask. She laughs softly, a dry, papery sound. "No. Men are remembered for the wars they start. I preferred the peace I built." One of the candles flickers violently, throwing her shadow huge across the wall. It looks almost like wings. "Historians," she murmurs, "still debate whether I loved my son too much or not enough. They never ask how much I loved my country." You glance down at her hands. Steady, ink-stained, disciplined. The kind of hands that build nations not through power, but through patience. She notices your gaze. "I prayed often," she says, "but prayer was only my cover. My true faith was in paperwork." You chuckle. "A queen of bureaucracy. A queen of survival," she corrects gently. The candles sputter again. Their flames bow low, then rise as though in respect. When you look up again, she is gone. Only the faint rustle of parchment remains, as if her pen had never stopped moving. You stand for a long while, the scent of beeswax thick in your lungs, before turning back toward the hall. Outside, the corridor seems brighter, as though dawn is finally catching up to you. You realize you've been walking all night, through centuries, through voices, through forgotten glories. And still there are more doors waiting. The next door opens easily, almost eagerly, as though history itself wants you to enter. The room beyond is filled with color. Blue glass windows, red cushions, green tiles patterned with vines. Sunlight pools on the floor in warm shapes, and the air smells faintly of saffron and oranges. This is not a northern palace. You're somewhere farther south, Spain, perhaps, or Naples. A woman sits cross-legged on a low dais, her hair braided with gold thread, her fingers tracing a pattern in the dust. When she looks up, her gaze is sharp, intelligent, and amused. Eleanor of Naples. Few remember her now. A princess married into Spanish politics, a queen whose story was almost lost between wars and alliances. But she was a strategist, a scholar, and, by all accounts, the only person who could outwit her own counsel. "You've come a long way," she says. "Do you remember them all?" You pause. Some faces blur. She nods. "Good. Memory should never be perfect. It's kinder that way." Her voice is calm but carries the weight of irony. Someone who's had to learn grace in the company of fools. A servant enters quietly, sets down a silver tray with figs and almonds, and vanishes. Eleanor takes a fig, splits it with delicate precision, and offers half to you. You hesitate, then accept. The sweetness hits your tongue, soft and fragrant. "They thought me ornamental," she says. "So I learned to decorate my intelligence in silence." You raise an eyebrow. And then I used it." Her laughter is quiet but rich, like the rustle of silk. Historians still debate whether I was devout or deceptive, she continues. But tell me, must faith and cunning always be enemies? You don't answer. You don't need to. The way she looks at you, half challenge, half invitation, says she already knows. Outside the windows, the sound of bells drifts in from the harbor. The sea glints beyond, alive and restless. Eleanor turns toward it, her profile cut against the bright light. I prayed every night, she says softly. Not for salvation, for strategy. You blink. When you open your eyes again, she's gone. The air still hums faintly with her voice, her presence. Somewhere between a lesson and a lullaby. You exhale. The scent of oranges lingers. And you step back through the door, into the corridor that feels now like a living thing, breathing, shifting, waiting. At the far end, 2 more doors glimmer faintly in the dark, as if whispering your name. You walk toward them, slowly, as the echoes of forgotten queens trail behind you like the soft hem of a gown. You've lost track of time now, though perhaps that's the point. The corridors blur, the stone softens, and you begin to feel as though you're drifting through something half-remembered, half-dreamed. Somewhere, faintly, the sound of bells fades into the low murmur of rain. The next door appears as if it's always been there. It's wood warped by weather, the brass handle cold against your skin. You push it open. The scent that greets you is unlike the others. Less polished, more real. It smells of damp linen, old roses, and the faint mineral tang of ink. Inside, the room is smaller, crowded with books, scraps of parchment, and a single flickering candle that looks exhausted from its duty. By the window, wrapped in a simple shawl, sits a woman with tired eyes and the posture of someone who has been patient for far too long. And of Bohemia, not the famous one, not the queen who married Richard II of England, but another and lesser known who spent her youth in exile and her adulthood in quiet endurance. She was queen to Sigismund, Holy Roman Emperor, but power never belonged to her. Only endurance did. You approach softly, but she doesn't turn. Her eyes are on the window pane, where the rain trickles in trembling lines. You're the one who listens, she says without looking back. You nod, though she can't see. Then listen, she says, and her voice, though soft, carries a steel thread through it. They say queens are remembered by what they built. I built patience. You glance at the pile of letters near her hand, half sealed, half forgotten. Some are addressed to no one, some to herself. One catches your eye. The seal bears a tiny emblem, a crowned stag. That one, you say. Who's it for? She smiles faintly. Someone who would never answer. The candlelight wavers as she lifts a page, eyes scanning the words. I wrote of small things, she continues, of the sound of rain on glass, the color of morning over Prague. If the world would not remember me, then let it at least remember the way it felt to live. Her fingers tremble slightly as she sets the page down. Historians, she says quietly, still argue whether I loved my husband. I suppose I did. I loved him as one might love a passing storm. Beautiful, destructive, and beyond reason. A gust of wind pushes against the window, and she looks up suddenly, startled. Did you hear that? She whispers. You tilt your head. It's only the wind, but she smiles as though she's heard something else entirely. Forgiveness, she says. It sounds like that. The candle sputters, and for a moment, everything goes black. When the light returns, she is gone. Her shawl folded neatly on the chair, her letters sealed at last. You take one final look at the rain-streaked window. Outside, dawn seems to be trying its luck again, and so you move on. The next door is brighter. Its hinges oiled, its wood freshly polished. You open it, and a burst of color and laughter hits you. For the first time, the air feels alive. The hall you step into is filled with music. Strings, lutes, the rhythmic clatter of feet against tiled floor. Sunlight pours through open arches, gilding everything it touches. You smell jasmine and freshly baked bread. You hear a faint ripple of laughter that feels almost scandalous in this solemn palace. A woman dances at the center of it all, her gown light, her movements sure. She's no prisoner of formality. She's poetry in motion. Isabella of Aragon. But not the Isabella you think. Not the queen who funded Columbus. Not the one carved into every textbook. This Isabella was Duchess of Milan, a woman born into brilliance and buried under politics. When she sees you, she doesn't stop dancing. She only tilts her head slightly, as if to say, "Keep up." You don't, of course. You're far too slow for her rhythm. When she finally pauses, she's breathing hard but smiling. A smile so alive it could light the room without candles. "They said I should smile less," she says. "That queens should be solemn." You grin. "And you ignored them?" "Of course," she says. "I was tired of being a statue." You sit as musicians pack their instruments, bowing to her as they leave. The moment they're gone, the queen's poise softens. She pours wine into 2 cups, one for you, one for herself. "They wrote songs about my grace," she says, "but none about my boredom." You take a sip. The wine is sweet and lazy, the kind that forgets itself halfway through. "Historians still argue," she says, "whether I was more beautiful or more dangerous." You raise your cup. "Why not both?" She laughs. A bright, easy sound that cuts through the solemn air of centuries. "I like you," she says. "You remind me of freedom." Then her expression softens. But freedom is never kind to queens. It arrives late and leaves early. Outside, a dove lands on the balcony, cooing softly. She extends her hand, and it flutters away. You can tell she's used to that feeling, beauty that won't stay. "I danced," she says, "because the floor was mine, even when the throne was not." She looks toward the open sky beyond the arches, her profile sharp against the morning sun. "Remember this," she says quietly. "Joy was my rebellion." The music fades entirely, and so does she. All that remains is the echo of her laughter, bright and defiant, curling like smoke toward the rafters. You close your eyes and breathe in. That's when you realize this journey isn't just about forgotten queens. It's about how they endured forgetting. The palace feels quieter now. Not empty, just thoughtful. Your footsteps slow as the light changes again, from gold to amber, then to the dim silver of twilight. The next door stands half open, as though waiting for someone who's late. You step through. The room inside is filled with tapestries depicting battles, saints, and, curiously, gardens. But all of them share one small detail: a woman, always watching from the edge of the scene. In one, she holds a book. In another, a crown. In the last, a single rose. You turn, and there she is, Joan of Navarre, widow of Henry the Fourth of England, stepmother to a king, accused of witchcraft, imprisoned by her own son-in-law, and yet remembered in the end not as a sorceress, but as a survivor. She sits beside a fire, her hair streaked with silver, her gown simple but dignified. A small silver cross hangs from her neck. "You're late," she says. You smile faintly. "So I've been told." She gestures for you to sit. Her voice, when she speaks again, is surprisingly light. "They said I bewitched the king," she says. "But truly, I only listened to him. That was enough to make men uneasy." You chuckle softly. "Some things never change." Her eyes twinkle. "Indeed, they called it witchcraft. I called it emotional intelligence. The fire pops as though applauding her. Historians still debate, she adds, whether I practiced sorcery. I did not. Though, she leans in conspiratorially, I did once wish for silence in court, and it worked. For nearly half an hour. You laugh quietly, and she smiles, pleased. But the humor fades quickly, replaced by something more fragile. I spent 7 years locked away, she says. They took my jewels, my servants, my name, but not my memory. I recited every verse I knew, every prayer, until the silence became mine. The firelight flickers across her face. You realize she's not bitter, just tired. I forgave them all, she says softly. Not for their sake, for mine. The embers dim, glowing like tiny stars in the hearth. You ask, was it worth it? The forgiveness. She thinks for a moment. It was quiet. That was enough. The room falls still. You look again at the tapestries, the woman in the corner of each scene watching. You finally understand. She wasn't background. She was the witness, the one who saw everything and stayed. When you look back, Joan is gone. Only the silver cross remains on the chair, gleaming faintly in the firelight. You rise, feeling the quiet settle into you like dust. Outside the door, the corridor stretches ahead, endless, patient, and softly waiting. And as you walk forward, the silence feels almost like company. You walk again. The sound of your footsteps is softer now, cushioned by ancient rugs and the slow, sleepy rhythm of dust motes drifting through candlelight. You can feel how deep into the palace you've gone. Like you've passed the outer stories, the famous names, and are now sinking into the forgotten marrow of history. The next door is half hidden behind a tapestry. You pull it aside, and there's a faint scent of lavender, beeswax, and something else. Ink, perhaps. You step in quietly. At first, you think the room is empty. Then, a soft voice says, "You're standing on my papers." You look down. Sure enough, a dozen sheets of parchment are scattered at your feet, covered in tight, looping handwriting. Behind a desk, a woman sits bent over a candle. Her hair is tucked beneath a wimple, her quill moving quickly. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England, warrior, diplomat, political survivor, and, at the moment very clearly an exhausted writer. She looks up at you briefly, then back to her page. "If I don't write it down," she murmurs, "they'll tell my story without me. And we both know how that ends." You pick up one of the pages, turning it over carefully. The words are a mix of sharp intelligence and weary defiance. Historians say, she continues, that I was too ambitious, that I led armies, schemed, destroyed my own peace. But they never write about how small my room was when I plotted. You glance around. The walls are close. The air feels heavy with ink and regret. They remember the wars, she says, but not the waiting. She leans back, stretching her fingers. The candlelight flickers across her tired face. "Do you know what ambition really is?" she asks. "It's the sound of no one else stepping up." You don't answer. You don't need to. Outside, thunder rolls distant, slow. She doesn't flinch. "They said I was the she-wolf of France," she says. "They said I wore armor. I did neither. I wore grief mostly." You sit, and for a while she keeps writing. The only sounds are the scratch of quill on parchment and the faint drip of rain outside. "Historians still debate," she says quietly, "whether I ever loved my son or merely used him as a symbol." She pauses, looking down at her ink-stained fingers. "Symbols die faster than children," she whispers. The candle gutters, and she straightens, forcing composure back into her voice. "Still," she says, Someone must remember that I tried. Even failure deserves a record. You want to tell her that she succeeded, that centuries later her name still burns bright, but she wouldn't believe you. Queens like her rarely get to know how history softens with time. Instead, you just nod, and she smiles faintly, her expression one of quiet recognition. Go, she says. Let me finish the sentence. And so you do. The door closes behind you, and the sound of her pen continues, steady and stubborn, long after she fades from view. The next door stands slightly ajar, the air around it warmer, humming faintly with sound. You push it open, and laughter greets you. You blink, momentarily dazzled. The room is filled with gold, gilded mirrors, polished floors, and a fire that seems to dance just to be admired. At the center, reclining on a chaise draped in crimson velvet, sits Christina of Denmark, young, sharp-eyed, and clearly enjoying herself. Ah, she says, smiling. Another visitor come to marvel at the almost queen. You step closer. Almost. She tilts her head with mock sadness. Henry VIII wanted to marry me once, she says. I said no. You can't help it, you laugh. Yes, she continues. Apparently he didn't take it well. But then, few tyrants do when told they're not someone's type. She rises gracefully and pours wine into 2 crystal goblets. He sent painters, letters, promises. I sent back a polite refusal and a portrait with the caption, if I had 2 heads, one would be at the King of England's disposal. You nearly choke on your drink. Historians still debate, she says, whether I meant it as a jest or a warning. She grins. I assure you it was both. The firelight glows against her face, brightening her mischief. She seems utterly untouched by fear or doubt, only amused by the absurdities of kings and power. Queens are supposed to say yes, she says. But sometimes, saying no is a better legacy. You glance around. The mirrors reflect her image endlessly. An infinite array of Christinas, each one smirking, each one perfectly composed. But you never married at all, you say. She shrugs, light as air. Why ruin a good reputation for the sake of ceremony? I ruled my duchy, entertained ambassadors, and spent the rest of my life outliving everyone who thought I'd fade away. She turns toward one of the mirrors and straightens her collar, watching herself. The truth is, she says softly, some queens don't need thrones. They just need time to be remembered properly. You think about that as she lifts her cup in a lazy toast. To freedom, she says, and to women who knew better. The glass glints like sunlight off a sword. Then, as all the others before her, she fades, her laughter lingering in the room like perfume. You leave with a small, involuntary smile, realizing that history, for all its cruelty, occasionally rewards audacity. By now, the corridors have grown long and echoing. The air is cooler again, less scented, more somber. The kind of quiet that invites reflection. A faint sound guides you forward, something between a sigh and a hymn. You follow it to a narrow spiral staircase that descends into shadow. At the bottom, a door waits. Heavy oak, iron hinges. You push it open. The room is a chapel, but barely. Cracked plaster, faded frescoes, and a single candle burning in a puddle of wax. Before the altar stands a figure in black velvet, her back straight, her hands clasped. Catherine of Braganza, Queen of England, wife of Charles II, daughter of Portugal, and perhaps one of the loneliest queens in European history. She turns as you enter, her dark eyes calm, unreadable. You're here, she says simply. You nod. I was never meant to be loved, she says, her accent soft but precise. I was meant to be useful. She moves to the altar, touching the cool stone surface with care. "Tea," she murmurs suddenly. "They say I brought it to England. Imagine being remembered for a beverage." You smile faintly. "It's a popular one." "Yes," she says, "but it wasn't meant to be mine. It was meant to soothe others." Her fingers trace the rim of a silver chalice. "Historians still debate whether I was happy. I wasn't. But happiness was never the point." You want to protest, to say she changed culture, that she mattered, but she waves it off. "They called me dull," she says, "because I didn't laugh at courts games. I found them exhausting. I prayed while they plotted." A long silence passes. Then she adds, with faint amusement, "I suppose prayer was my rebellion." The candle sputters, casting shadows across her face. "They forget," she says softly, "that endurance is an art. To stand quietly while your world mocks you. There is grace in that." Her voice trembles slightly, but she straightens again. You find yourself back in the great corridor, the one lined with portraits and history that watches from the walls. The air feels thicker now, full of incense and age. Each step you take echoes as though you're walking not on stone, but on centuries. The next doorway you pass is arched and flanked by tapestries of faded blue and gold. The sound of pages turning floats through. You push open the door gently. Inside sits a woman at a long wooden table, surrounded by open books. She's small, quiet, but her eyes are sharp, calculating, even in calm. The candlelight pools around her ink-stained hands. "Don't interrupt," she says without looking up. "I'm trying to decide which version of myself they'll believe." You recognize her from the portraits, the coins, the whispered comparisons, and of Brittany. Twice a queen of France, once by strategy, once by sheer political exhaustion. She glances at you with mild curiosity. "Do you know what it's like," she asks, "to be married for your country, not once but twice, to the same throne?" You shake your head, and she smirks softly. "It's like being told you're indispensable but replaceable all the same." She dips her quill and continues writing, slow and deliberate. "They said I brought refinement to France. Lace, etiquette, that sort of thing. But what I really brought," she sighs, "was stability no one thanked me for." The clock ticks faintly in the background. The wind rattles the shutters. "Historians still debate," she murmurs, "whether I was shrewd or simply tired." You tilt your head, and she laughs. A small, weary sound. "Both, I suppose. You can't survive 2 royal marriages without mastering both." Her laughter fades, and she sets the quill down. "Do you know what I wanted most?" she asks quietly. "A book of my own. Not about treaties or heirs. Just mine." She gestures around her at the books she's gathered. Genealogies, letters, treaties, and you realize they're all written by men. "That's why I write now," she says, almost whispering. "Because someday, someone might look for me and find only silence." You step closer, seeing the small, careful script on the page. "It's not history, it's memory. I wish I could tell them," she says softly, "that I was more than a signature on a treaty." The candle gutters. She leans back and closes her eyes. "Go on," she murmurs. "There's another waiting." As you turn to leave, a single page flutters off the table and lands at your feet. You catch a glimpse of her handwriting. Just one line. "To be remembered properly is to be seen as human." You tuck the page away gently and step back into the corridor. It feels as though the palace has shifted again, its hallways rearranging to guide you somewhere specific. The scent of roses and fire greets you next, along with the low hum of voices. You enter a grand hall filled with shadows and silks. At the center of it all stands Mary of Scotland, draped in black velvet, her eyes bright and restless. She's speaking softly to someone you can't see. Perhaps herself, perhaps a ghost. When she notices you, she smiles. Don't worry. I'm used to visitors who arrive too late. Her voice carries both charm and melancholy, each syllable shaped by tragedy she refuses to dramatize. I was queen when I was 6 days old, she says with a small shrug. Imagine that, an infant with power, though not enough to decide nap time. You sit across from her, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. They say you were reckless, you venture. Mary laughs, a sound like cracked glass. They always do when a woman chooses too quickly, don't they? She reaches for a goblet of wine, swirls it, and watches the ripples. Historians still debate whether I truly plotted against Elizabeth, she says. I think I just ran out of good options. Her gaze softens. You know what they don't write about? The waiting, the hours in captivity, the embroidery, the silence. You glance at the tapestry behind her, a half-finished depiction of a stag hunt. She notices. Yes, she says. I sewed that. 30 years. And no one wrote about my hands. The fire pops softly. She smiles, but her voice drops lower. I prayed. I wrote letters. I tried to be remembered well. But sometimes, history doesn't care for your good intentions. The wind rattles the windows. I dyed in white, she says suddenly. Did you know that? They say it was a symbol of innocence, but it was just the best gown I had left. You sit in silence for a long moment. She seems both ghost and woman, both royal and human. Then she sighs. Tell them I was not tragic, she says. Tell them I was simply alive. You nod and she smiles. That's enough. When you turn to leave, the sound of the wind fades into music. Soft, distant, uncertain. The kind that follows a soul long after its story ends. The corridors now feel familiar. You've walked them so long that even their echoes seem to recognize your steps. You pass portraits that seem to watch you go. Faces lit softly by candlelight, eyes tired but knowing. At the end of the hall, a large door waits. It's carved with vines and birds and words half-worn by time. You push it open. The scent of ink and beeswax greets you again. But this time it's layered with something sharper, salt. The room overlooks the sea. And there, seated by the window, is Isabella of Castile. Not the fragile kind of queen who waits, but one who's tired of pretending strength is easy. She turns slowly, her hands folded over a map spread across the table. Ah, she says. You found me near the end of things. You glance at the map. It's marked with routes, ships, and foreign names. They call me the mother of an empire, she says almost wryly. That's just another way of saying I worried about 1,000 things I could not see. She traces one of the lines with her fingertip. I signed my name on paper, and men crossed oceans for me. Imagine the arrogance. Or the faith. Historians still argue which it was. You step closer, and she looks at you, her expression unreadable. They remember the discoveries, she says, but not the prayers. I spent nights begging that none of it would collapse before dawn. A pause. The wind pushes against the glass. They say I was ruthless, she continues. Perhaps I was. Power is heavy. You can't hold it gently for long. She looks down at her hands, lined with ink stains. I made choices no one should have to make, but I made them anyway, because no one else would. Her voice softens, almost as if speaking to herself. That's the curse of ruling. Even when you win, it doesn't feel like victory. Outside, waves crash faintly against the cliffs below. You can smell the salt through the cracks in the window. I thought I would be remembered for the faith that guided me, she says. But instead, I'm remembered for the ships that left without me. She turns her gaze back to the horizon. They went west. I stayed here. For a long time, neither of you speak. The candle flickers once, twice. Finally, she says, "Tell them I was not a conqueror. Tell them I was afraid." Her tone is simple, quiet, utterly human. You nod. She seems relieved, like a weight has lifted. "Good," she says softly. "Now go. There are others still waiting." As you close the door behind you, the sea wind follows, cold and steady, carrying her final words down the corridor like a fading prayer. You walk again, slowly, feeling the palace shift around you, the air full of names and memories. It's almost midnight here, though time feels irrelevant now. And in the distance, another door glows faintly, ready to open. You keep walking. You wake, or perhaps you never slept, beside a hearth that hums with low orange light. The warmth reaches your fingers, your eyes half closed from its rhythm. You're in a small, quiet chamber that smells of wool, beeswax, and lavender. A woman hums softly as she braids her hair. She's not a queen by presence alone. Her calm commands the room. You realize, after a moment, that this is Margaret of Anjou, the fierce rose of the Wars of the Roses. Though right now she looks less like a warrior and more like someone simply tired of surviving her own story. She glances at you through the reflection in a bronze mirror. "They'll say I was too proud," she murmurs. "Too bold. They always say that about women who speak louder than a whisper." The fire crackles. She twists her braid into a knot and pins it with a thin dagger. "Do you know what it's like to rule for someone else's crown?" she asks, her voice soft but edged. "To fight battles, not for glory, but because every man around you thinks you'll yield if you don't?" You shake your head. She smiles faintly. "You wouldn't like it. It's all waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for death, waiting for men to make up their minds about you." She stands and walks to the fire, the light painting her face with flickers of gold. "Historians still debate whether I was the real power behind Henry," she says, as if there were ever any power to be found in that trembling man. Her voice is dry, but there's sorrow underneath. "Do you know what I wanted?" she asks. "Peace. I wanted the fighting to stop. But peace is a luxury for the men who start wars, not for the women who have to clean up afterward." The wind hisses outside. "I rode into battle once," she continues, "and they called me unnatural, because a woman on a horse was worse than a man with a sword." She turns to you now, eyes bright with tired defiance. "I never wanted to be famous. I wanted to be heard." There's a silence, a soft one, heavy as snow. "I loved my son," she says finally, "and they killed him. After that, all the crowns in the world looked like iron cages." Her hands tremble just once before she hides them in her sleeves. "I'm supposed to say I forgive them," she whispers. "But forgiveness is another word men like to hear women say." She looks into the fire, and for a moment you think she might throw the dagger in. But instead, she takes a slow breath and says, "Tell them I was not cruel. Tell them I was just awake when they preferred me asleep." You promise her quietly, and she nods once. Then she returns to her chair, the firelight dimming to embers as her hum resumes. Low, steady, and unbroken. You step outside into a long gallery lit only by the moon. The marble beneath your feet glows faintly blue. Far at the end of the hall, another door stands ajar, the light within flickering between gold and shadow. You enter to find a figure leaning against a pillar, surrounded by scrolls and the faint scent of ink. Her crown rests at her feet. "Ah," she says, not turning. "Another listener. Good. I was starting to think history had gone deaf. It's Blanche of Castile, mother of St. Louis, the queen who ruled while pretending she wasn't ruling." Her voice is sharp, her humor dry. Do you know, she says, they used to call me the most pious woman in France, which is funny, because all I ever prayed for was competence in my counsel. You laugh softly. She glances at you, smirking. They don't write about the nights I didn't sleep, she says, unrolling a parchment. They don't write about the letters I forged, the treaties I twisted, the bishops I bribed. But they do write about my son, my saint. She lifts her gaze. They called me devout. I suppose that's what you call a woman who survives power without scandal. She moves closer to the window, moonlight catching the fine lines at her eyes. Historians still debate, she says, whether I was truly devout or merely clever. She tilts her head, smiling faintly, as if those were ever different things. You walk with her along the gallery, the night echoing faintly beyond. I told my son, she says, better to be humble than powerful. He didn't listen. No one ever does. Her tone softens. I tried to teach him mercy. I tried to make him kind. And he was, until the world taught him that kingship rewards cruelty more quickly. She picks up her crown again and studies it, as if expecting it to speak. They think motherhood makes you soft, she murmurs. But it makes you dangerous. You'll do anything to keep your child alive, even if it means becoming the monster they fear. The silence between you grows comfortable. The moonlight deepens. At last, she places the crown back on her head, not proudly, but wearily. Tell them I was not a saint, she says. Tell them I was his teacher. You nod. She smiles, half amused. Good. Then history will at least get that much right. When you step back into the corridor, you realize the palace feels fuller now, alive with whispers and the rustle of dresses. It's as if the walls are remembering with you. The portraits along the hall seem softer than before, their painted eyes no longer sharp with judgment. Perhaps they, too, are tired of pretending perfection. And somewhere deep inside you, you feel it, the slow warmth of understanding that these queens, forgotten or feared, never truly ruled from thrones. They ruled from the quiet places. Letters, tears, prayers, patience. You keep walking, your footsteps swallowed by the sound of the wind. There are still more to meet. The corridor narrows, lit by torches that hiss when the draft passes through. Ahead, the faint strains of music echo, harp, maybe, or lute. You follow it, slow and steady, until you find yourself in a room that feels more like a poem than a place. There she sits, Eleanor of Aquitaine, grand and golden even in shadow. She looks up from her seat, eyes sharp with the kind of intellect that could slice through kingdoms. You're late, she says. But then again, so was most of Europe. You smile and she gestures for you to sit. I suppose you've heard, she begins, that I was beautiful, dangerous, scandalous, the perfect trilogy for gossip. Her smirk is slow, knowing. They talk about my husbands. They never talk about my ideas. She leans forward, elbows on the armrest. I was queen of 2 countries, mother of 10 children, and patron of more poets than sense allows. But all anyone remembers is that I rode on crusade and argued with the king. She waves a hand dismissively. Historians still debate whether I was truly as influential as they say, which is their polite way of wondering if I was too clever for comfort. Her eyes glint. I was. The harp music drifts from somewhere unseen. You notice her fingers tapping along to its rhythm. You know what they called courtly love? She asks. An invention, a distraction. But it was a revolution, a way for women to speak when the church said silence was holiness. Her gaze softens, and for a moment she looks almost wistful. I wanted beauty. I wanted art. I wanted to be remembered for more than politics. But history prefers its women practical, not poetic. You nod. She laughs quietly. You're kind. That's rare here. The firelight flickers, painting her face in gold and bronze. Do you know what I regret? She asks. Nothing. Every mistake I made was mine. Every choice mine. That's more than most queens ever get. She leans back, eyes half closed. Tell them I wasn't a legend. Tell them I was just loud enough not to be erased. Her smile lingers, then fades as she whispers, Go on. There's still time to remember the quiet ones. You leave her chamber and step into another, smaller, dimmer. The scent of damp parchment fills the air. A woman in simple black sits by the fire, her crown lying forgotten beside her. She's writing in a tiny, neat hand, the pages stacked high around her chair. This is Catherine de' Medici, though she looks more like a weary scholar than a queen. Don't look so afraid, she says without looking up. I'm not poisoning anyone tonight. You laugh nervously. She smiles thinly. That's good. Laughter means you've read the wrong historians. She dips her quill again. They say I was ruthless. They forget I lived through 10 civil wars. I call that context. You sit down near the fire, and she watches you over the top of her parchment. Historians still debate, she says, whether I caused the bloodshed or merely survived it. I wonder if they'd ask the same about a king. Her tone is even detached. I built gardens, libraries, observatories, she continues. But all they remember are the rumors. You glance at the pages around her, letters, drafts, calculations. I wanted peace, she says softly. I wanted my sons to live, but they listened to everyone except their mother. Her hands tremble slightly as she writes another line. The hardest part of power is knowing what must be done, and watching others ruin it anyway. She places her quill down and looks straight at you. They think I was cruel, she says quietly. Maybe I was, but cruelty is just mercy that's run out of time. The firelight deepens, flickering through the stacks of paper. I tried to hold France together, she whispers, but sometimes history prefers a villain to a tired woman. She closes the book and pushes it toward you. Take it. I'm finished explaining myself. You lift it carefully, feeling the weight of the pages. The title reads only, For My Children, in case they ever listen. You meet her eyes. She smiles, thin but sincere. Now go, she says. And remember that even poison, in the right measure, can heal. The fire cracks once more. You leave her there, surrounded by her papers and ghosts. The corridor awaits again, quieter now. Somewhere in the distance, a clock begins to chime. Slow, deliberate, and inevitable. The night isn't over yet. The chime fades into silence, and for a moment, the palace feels suspended, like the air itself is pausing to listen. You follow a narrow staircase downward, the stone steps spiraling, cold and echoing beneath your feet. Somewhere above, the wind hums through the cracks, the kind of sound that could be mistaken for a sigh if you were feeling poetic, which by now you are. The stairs open into a dim chapel. Candles flicker, each one fighting for life against the chill. At the far end, kneeling before an altar, is a woman in a gown so pale it might be mistaken for moonlight. Her hair is loose, her posture regal even in prayer. You recognize her almost immediately, and of Bohemia, the gentle queen who married Richard II. A figure mostly forgotten in the grand theater of English monarchs. And yet, she was the one who made the stage a little softer. You're not from here, she says without turning. You admit it quietly. That's all right, she replies. Neither was I. Her accent lingers faintly in her speech, a reminder that once, long before English queens were expected to be English. She had come from far away to marry a man she barely knew. They said I brought peace, she murmurs, and books. They never mention that I brought loneliness, too. She lights another candle. Historians still debate whether I truly loved him. I suppose it depends on what you mean by love. She looks over her shoulder, her eyes kind but tired. He was complicated, brilliant, vain, frightened. Sometimes he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Sometimes he looked at me like I was furniture. You smile faintly, and she catches it. Yes, she says. Marriage in the 14th century. The romance of a contract. You sit beside her in silence for a while. The air smells of wax and stone and the faint sweetness of rose oil. I taught him to read, she says. Not words, he already knew those. I taught him to read people. I think he almost learned. Her voice grows softer. When I died, they said he wept for days. He ordered my room left untouched, as though I might return. I suppose that's a kind of love too. A single drop of wax falls onto the floor. The candle sputters, then steadies. Tell them, she whispers, that kindness isn't weakness. Tell them that patience is the hardest rebellion. You promise you will. She smiles, faint and flickering as the flame beside her. And then, as quietly as you arrived, you step back into the corridor, leaving her surrounded by candles, light blooming like small prayers in the dark. The corridor turns, leading to a heavy wooden door carved with the image of a crowned woman holding a scepter and a sword. You push it open, and the air inside smells of salt and parchment. Maps cover the walls of England, of the sea, of faraway coasts sketched in fading ink. And there she is, Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen, sitting by a window, hair silvered with age but eyes still sharp as frost. Another ghost come to visit? She says dryly, not looking up. You tell her you're more of a traveler. Ah, she says, the polite kind of ghost. She sets down her quill. They called me a witch. Isn't that always the way? If you're clever, you must have made a deal with something dark. Her smile is bitter but amused. Historians still debate whether I ensnared Edward with sorcery. I'll tell you a secret. I didn't need magic. Men fall in love with trouble all by themselves. She stands, walking slowly across the room. Her gown rustles like dry leaves. I was a widow, she says, poor, landless, with 2 children. And then the king rode past my house and saw me. They say I waited beneath an oak tree with my sons, begging for justice. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? She laughs once, quietly. It was strategy. My family taught me survival. And survival, in our world, was a woman's cleverest sin. You watch as she opens a chest filled with letters and locks of hair, each one carefully bound. They never forgive women who win, she murmurs, especially not when they win without permission. You notice her hands tremble slightly as she picks up a ribbon. I lost so much, she says. My sons, my crown, my peace. They vanished into walls and whispers. But they can't vanish me. The wind outside presses against the window pane, as if trying to listen. Do you know the strangest part? She asks softly. I don't regret it. Not the scheming, not the danger, not the ambition. Because every move I made was for survival. And survival is its own kind of throne. She looks at you now, her eyes unflinching. Tell them I wasn't a witch. Tell them I was awake. You nod. She returns to her desk, dipping her quill once more. The ink catches the lamplight, dark and shining like secrets that will outlive her. When you step back into the hall, the air feels colder. But you're warmer for having met her. The corridor is narrowing again, spiraling deeper into something, memory, maybe. You can't tell where it ends or begins anymore. You think of the queens you've met. Fierce, kind, weary, clever. Each one misunderstood in her own century. Each one still waiting, somehow, to be remembered properly. The wind hums again, like the turning of a page. And somewhere far below, another candle flickers to life. You follow. It's colder now and the walls are damp. You descend another staircase, this one leading underground. The torches grow sparse, replaced by small lamps set into the stone. You can hear the faint dripping of water somewhere far off. At the bottom there's a room, a crypt maybe, though it feels more like a vault of stories than of bones. And in the center stands a woman in dark velvet, her hands folded neatly. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten me," she says with a smile that's both patient and pointed. It's Mary of Scotland, her red hair dimly lit by the flickering lamps. "I've been waiting down here for a while," she says. "You'd think someone would have rewritten my ending by now." You bow slightly, and she waves it off. "Oh, don't bother with that. I had enough of that pomp in life. Tell me instead, do they still argue about me?" You tell her they do. Constantly. She laughs softly. "Good. At least I'm not boring." She walks slowly around the chamber. "They say I was reckless, that I trusted too easily, that I let my heart steer my crown." Her tone is wry, as though men never did the same and called it bravery. She pauses beside an old map pinned to the wall. "Historians still debate whether I plotted against Elizabeth. I didn't, or maybe I did. By then, I'd lost track of what counted as plotting." You smile faintly, and she returns it. You see, power doesn't feel like glory. It feels like waiting for permission to breathe. She touches the cold stone wall, tracing the carved fleur-de-lis with her fingertip. "I prayed, you know," she says. "I prayed that my son would be safe. I prayed that my name wouldn't rot before my bones did." There's a silence that feels like centuries. "I don't think I was made for ruling," she admits softly. "I was made for feeling, for poetry, for music. But the crown never asks what you're made for. It tells you." The lamplight trembles and you see, for just a moment, the young girl she once was, laughing, running, singing in the French sun. Then it fades, replaced by the tired queen before you. "Tell them," she says, "that I was not a fool. I was just human, and humanity is rarely tidy." You nod. She smiles one last time, a quiet, resigned sort of grace. "Now go," she says. "Elizabeth's upstairs somewhere, pacing." You climb another staircase, narrow, uneven, as though history itself is making you earn this next meeting. When you reach the top, you find a long gallery lined with windows. Outside, dawn is breaking. At the far end stands Elizabeth I, back straight, gaze fixed on the rising light. "You've met my cousin, haven't you?" she says without turning. She always had a flair for drama. Her tone is dry, her presence commanding even in silence. She turns to face you, eyes sharp as sunlight. "They call me Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Savior of England. I prefer Elizabeth." You incline your head, and she almost smiles. "Historians still debate," she says, "whether I truly loved anyone, as if love were the measure of a monarch." She begins to walk, her heels tapping softly on the marble. "I loved England. I loved words. I loved control. And yes, sometimes I loved the idea of being loved. But I never let it rule me." Her voice lowers. "That's the difference between me and Mary. She wanted to be adored. I wanted to be obeyed." You notice her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "Do you know what it costs to be untouchable?" she asks. "Everything." The light from the windows spills across her gown, making her seem both radiant and ghost-like. "They think I was cold," she says. I wasn't. I just learned early that warmth is weakness when the world's waiting to burn you. She pauses, looking out the window again. I never married because I already belonged to too many people. I was everyone's queen, and no one's wife. That was my curse and my choice. Her tone softens slightly. Tell them I laughed sometimes. Tell them I danced. Tell them I forgave no one, but I understood everyone. The sun crests the horizon, flooding the gallery with gold. History will remember me, she says quietly, but not as I was. That's all right. Every story needs its myth. You nod, and she finally looks at you fully. Go on, she says. You've still got centuries to walk through. The light is warm on your face now, and for a moment, you can almost believe that all these women, forgotten, feared, beloved, are still whispering through time. Their voices overlap, gentle and tired and endlessly brave. And as the morning sun spills across the hall, you feel something close to peace. The golden morning light fades as you step deeper into the next hallway, where sunlight gives way to dust and echo. The corridors of time are fickle like that, warm one moment, cold the next. You breathe in air that smells faintly of cedar and parchment, the scent of memories stored too long. The walls here are hung with portraits, women whose eyes follow you, soft yet unrelenting. Each frame carries a name most people skip over in their history books. The forgotten queens, the half-remembered wives, the placeholders between wars and men. At the end of the hall, a door stands ajar. Inside, you hear faint laughter, dry, clever, amused. You push gently and step into a grand chamber filled with velvet drapes, embroidery, and the faint perfume of lavender and irony. Seated at a writing desk, quill in hand, is Catherine de' Medici. She doesn't look up immediately. She's writing something sharp, something secret. When she does finally glance at you, her eyes gleam like polished glass, reflective, unreadable. You must be another of those wandering chroniclers, she says smoothly. Be careful. History is a dangerous language to translate. You smile faintly. They say you were ruthless. Her eyebrows rise. They say that about any woman who survives long enough to age. She sets her quill down. Do you know what it takes to rule France through 3 sons, each more fragile than the last? You must be stone, silk, and smoke all at once. A mother and a monarch. A witch and a widow. A candle flickers between you, illuminating the glint of a hidden dagger on her table. Ornamental, of course, though you suspect it wasn't always. Historians still debate whether I ordered the massacre, she says quietly, as if they expect I'd write the truth in my letters. Her tone is dry. I didn't plan it. I merely understood it. There's a difference. Sometimes a match lights itself when the room is already full of oil. She rises and crosses to the window, looking out at the imagined streets of Renaissance Paris. They feared me because I didn't flinch, because I smiled when they wanted me to cry, because I played their game and didn't lose. She turns back toward you. You know what the strangest thing is? They always remember my poison bottles, but never my libraries. You glance toward a shelf stacked with books bound in cracked leather, gilded with faded initials. I brought art to this court, she says softly. Music, poetry, perfume, and they remember the blood. Her voice hardens just slightly. It's easier, I suppose, to call a woman monstrous than to admit she was magnificent. A pause. Then her lips curve into something resembling humor. Tell them I wasn't evil. I was efficient. You laugh quietly, and she joins you. For a brief moment, she looks not like the Black Widow of French history, but simply a tired mother who's seen too many revolutions begin with excuses. Then she turns back to her desk. Now go. Before I start giving you advice on diplomacy you'll regret. You bow slightly, and as you step back through the door, you catch her final words, murmured almost to herself. Every queen is written twice, once by the truth, once by the survivors. You walk again and the hall widens. The air feels different, warmer, tinged with spices and salt air. You hear gulls, waves crashing faintly in the distance. You've crossed centuries again without noticing. The woman waiting for you now is draped in gold and indigo, her crown subtle but radiant. Her skin gleams like bronze in the filtered light. This is not Europe anymore. She turns toward you with calm authority, her voice like the steady rhythm of the Nile. I am Hatshepsut, she says simply, the queen who became king, the pharaoh who wore the false beard and ruled Egypt in peace for 2 decades while the world tried to forget her gender. You bow deeply this time. Do not bow, she says. Just listen. She walks slowly around you, her steps echoing in the great stone chamber. They erased me, she says softly. My name chiseled out, my statues broken. My nephew tried to make the world believe I never existed. Her gaze sharpens. But stone remembers. It remembers everything. You can feel the air vibrating slightly, as though her voice is touching something beneath the floor. I built temples, she continues, not for war, but for the sun. I sent ships south to the land of Punt for incense and gold. My people thrived. Her expression softens just a fraction. Historians still debate why they destroyed my name. Was it vengeance, jealousy, or the simple fear that a woman might prove too capable? She looks at you now, her eyes fierce and proud. Tell them that power does not belong to men or women. It belongs to whoever refuses to surrender it. Her hand rests lightly on a column carved with hieroglyphs that shimmer faintly in the lamplight. Time is kind to truth, she says. It buries the liars and raises the builders. You ask quietly if she regrets anything. Yes, she says, smiling faintly. That I didn't build higher. She turns back toward her temple's imagined horizon, and you realize she is not truly here. She is memory carved in stone, and you're standing in its shadow. The air trembles once more, like the echo of a drum. You close your eyes, and when you open them again, she is gone. But the scent of myrrh lingers, warm and heavy. You exhale slowly and continue onward. The next room feels smaller, cozier, like a study lined with books, a desk by the window, and the smell of ink and solitude. There's a woman here, too, though not royal by birth. She sits with the poise of someone who's learned to command through silence. Ah, she says softly. You've come a long way to find me. You recognize her instantly from her portraits. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who shaped kingdoms and generations, and still managed to be misunderstood by them all. She gestures for you to sit. They've told you the other stories, haven't they? The tragedies, the crowns, the betrayals. Mine is all of those, but also a good deal of boredom. You smile. Boredom. Oh yes, she says, laughing quietly. Imagine being the most powerful woman in Europe and still being expected to sit politely through Mass. The candlelight flickers across her face. I was Queen of France, then Queen of England. I raised crusaders, poets, and kings. I was imprisoned for rebellion, adored for my wit, despised for my will. Her tone softens. Historians still debate whether I loved Henry or merely tolerated him. Truthfully, it depends on the decade. You both laugh gently. I founded courts of love, she says wistfully. We spoke of honor, chivalry, affection. It was theater, of course, but it kept men polite for at least an evening. She leans back, studying you. Do you know what the hardest part of power is? Staying awake when everyone around you is dreaming. You ask if she ever regretted how history remembered her. Her smile is slow, knowing. No. I'm remembered, aren't I? That's all a queen can hope for. She rises, her gown whispering across the floor like distant applause. But tell them I was cleverer than they give me credit for. Tell them that love and power were never enemies. They were the same game played with different stakes. Her eyes soften. And tell them I never stopped laughing, even when I was locked away. The candle beside her flares suddenly brighter, then steadies. You look around the room once more. The books, the half-finished letter, the map of France and England connected by faint ink lines, and then step back toward the door. Eleanor inclines her head in farewell, her smile caught halfway between mischief and melancholy. As you leave, you think you hear her voice behind you, faint and wry. Try not to fall asleep in the next century. The company's dreadful. You can't help but smile. The corridor outside stretches onward, quieter now, as if the walls themselves are resting. You walk slowly, breathing in the stillness, the centuries of stories settling like dust around you. You realize something as you move. Each queen you've met was not just forgotten, but flattened, reduced to a single word: saint, witch, wife, widow. And yet, walking here, you feel the fullness of them again. Their laughter, their irritation, their hope. It's a strange comfort, the idea that what time erases, imagination can restore. The air hums faintly. The next door glows with faint blue light. You take one last deep breath, steady and slow. And then, with a soft push, you step through. You emerge into the hush of twilight. The air feels cooler here, scented faintly of salt, as though the sea isn't far off. The walls glimmer faintly with a silvery sheen, like the interior of a seashell. You've left Europe entirely now, stepping into a different rhythm of history. Slower, more deliberate, as though every moment has been chosen carefully. At the center of the room, seated beneath a gauzy canopy of embroidered silk, is Queen Seondeok of Silla, one of Korea's earliest queens, a ruler of the 7th century, whose wisdom and wit baffled her enemies and charmed her people. She turns her head slowly when you enter, her eyes gleaming like calm water at dusk. You walk gently, she says. That is good. The floor remembers footsteps. You bow lightly. She gestures toward the stars painted on the ceiling above. Do you know why I built that tower? She asks. You look up, puzzled, and then realize what she means. Gyeomseongdi, the ancient stone observatory that still stands in Gyeongju. I built it to read the heavens, she says softly. They called it strange that a woman should study the stars. But I think they feared what I might learn from them. A breeze stirs the silk. You hear crickets outside, and the faint song of water running through a garden. She speaks again, quietly. They say I could see the future, perhaps, but mostly I paid attention. You smile faintly. Historians still debate whether you truly predicted the rebellion that came. Her eyes sparkle with amusement. Oh, I didn't predict it. I provoked it, so I could end it before it began. There it is, the edge of her humor. Dry as the stones of her tower, but alive with mischief. Power, she says, is like wind. You can't trap it, but you can learn where it blows. She leans forward slightly. When I ruled, I didn't need armies. I needed patience. I ruled not by fear, but by curiosity. Men underestimate that. Her tone turns softer. Do you know the strangest part? They tell stories of my beauty, my grace, my gentle words. But no one remembers how much I laughed. The sound escapes her lips now. A warm, melodic laugh that fills the chamber like light spilling through clouds. She rises and crosses to a small, round table where an oil lamp burns beside a scroll. Tell your listeners this, she says. A queen can build towers from thought alone. But she must never forget to look up. She points to the painted stars. That is the only thing that endures. The lamp flickers. The walls pulse softly with blue. The sound of water deepens. When you blink, she's gone. Or perhaps she stepped back into the stars she studied. You stand quietly for a long time, watching the night drift in through the open lattice window. You wonder if she knew that, centuries later, her observatory would still stand, and that people would still look up, remembering the queen who built it for the stars. The thought soothes you. The sea hums outside, and you breathe in time with the waves. You walk again. The corridor now feels like a dream half forgotten. Soft sand beneath your feet, faint singing in the air. The sound grows clearer as you move. A low chant, rhythmic and strong. You follow it until the walls seem to open like a curtain of air. Now you're standing in the sun, under a sky the color of melted bronze. Before you stands Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, Queen Nzinga of Angola, her gaze steady, her spine straight as the spear beside her. She's dressed in layers of red and white, the colors of kingship and resistance. Around her, the hum of a marketplace mingles with the murmur of soldiers. She greets you with a smile that could calm storms, or start them. "So," she says, "you've come to meet the woman who made the Portuguese nervous." Her laugh rolls out rich and amused. "I was a queen because I refused not to be," she says simply. She motions for you to walk beside her. The dust rises underfoot, soft and gold. "They sent men to take my land. I gave them words they couldn't untangle." You remember reading about her. The 17th century ruler who negotiated with colonial envoys, tricked generals, and forged alliances so deftly that even her enemies admired her. "You know," she says, glancing sideways, "they once made me wait for a meeting, no chair, no courtesy. So I had my servant kneel, and I sat on her back." She grins. "It wasn't cruelty. It was symbolism. They understood that." You can't help laughing quietly. Historians still debate whether that story is true. "Oh, it's true," she says. "And I'd do it again if I had to." Her expression turns thoughtful. "They wanted me to kneel. I wanted them to remember that I wouldn't." The air hums with heat. In the distance, drums beat faintly, slow, proud, eternal. "I fought with more than spears," she continues. "I fought with stories, with the kind of legend that makes even defeat look like defiance." She stops walking and looks directly at you. "Tell your audience this. Tell them that queenship is not about crowns. It's about posture. Even when the world insists you bow." You nod slowly. She smiles, satisfied. "Good. Then my work is not forgotten." A child runs past her, laughing, carrying a clay pot of water. Nzinga watches, her expression softening into something like peace. "Let them remember me as fierce," she murmurs. "But let them also remember that I loved my people." The air shimmers. The drums fade. When you blink, she's gone, leaving only a red scarf caught on the wind, twisting upward like a flag that refuses to fall. You stand still for a long moment, the dust glowing faintly in the dying sun. Then you turn back toward the endless corridor of time. The walls ripple and the sea returns. The tide of memory pulls you gently forward. You find yourself now in a place neither palace nor battlefield. A garden. Not one of luxury, but of deliberate peace. The sound of wind chimes mixes with soft birdsong. You walk along a narrow stone path lined with moss and lanterns. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of pine and rain-soaked earth. At the center of this quiet space sits Empress Dowager Cixi, ruler of late Qing China, a woman who governed from behind a silk screen and shaped an empire that pretended she wasn't in charge. Her gaze meets yours as you enter, patient, knowing, slightly amused. Be honest, she says, voice low and smooth. You expected a tyrant. You hesitate, then smile. Perhaps. She chuckles softly. Good. That means the stories still work. She pours tea into 2 porcelain cups, each painted with cranes and clouds. The steam rises between you like mist from another time. Historians still debate whether I ruined China, she says lightly, as though discussing the weather. But that's the benefit of ruling long enough. Everyone blames you eventually. You sip the tea, delicate, fragrant, bitter at the end. See, she folds her hands neatly. They say I clung to power. I prefer to say I preserved it. For 50 years, I kept the empire standing while the men collapsed around me. Her tone is measured, elegant. Do you know what the hardest part was? Pretending to need their permission. You glance around. Every inch of her garden is perfection, deliberate harmony of chaos and order. I learned from the arts, she continues. From calligraphy, from opera, from the balance of brushstrokes. Power must move like ink on paper. Fluid, graceful, irreversible. She looks at you now, eyes sharp. Remember that. Power that thrashes is power that dies. You nod quietly, understanding. For a moment, her expression softens. Do you know what I loved most? She says. The chrysanthemum. It blooms in autumn when the world grows cold. A reminder that beauty doesn't fear endings. You wake, if one can truly wake inside time, to the sound of gentle rain against glass. Not glass as we know it, perhaps, but something ancient and shimmering, like droplets on polished amber. The corridor feels hushed again, almost reverent. Somewhere a clock ticks, though you doubt it tells modern time. You walk toward the sound until the walls dissolve into candlelight. There she is, Margaret of Anjou, the French-born queen who once ruled England's destiny during the Wars of the Roses. The she-wolf, they called her. A woman with a crown too heavy and a world too sharp. She stands beside a high-backed chair, running her fingers along the worn armrest as though reading old thoughts in the wood grain. Her gown is black velvet. Her crown, thin and almost reluctant to gleam. When she speaks, her voice carries the steady calm of someone who has lost everything and found dignity in the ashes. They remember me for the blood, she says quietly. But no one remembers the winters. You listen. She moves toward the window, where candlelight flickers across her face. Do you know what it's like? She asks. To beg the wind not to blow through broken walls? To hold a child in one arm and a kingdom in the other? You shake your head, though she isn't really asking. They call me fierce, she continues. But fierceness is what grows when mercy dies of hunger. Her tone isn't angry, just tired, but in that dignified way of medieval exhaustion, where suffering is almost poetic. Historians still debate whether I truly loved my husband, she adds, almost idly. He was gentle, too gentle, the kind of man who prayed for peace while the wolves licked their lips. A pause. So I became the wolf instead. You catch her faint smirk, though it barely lifts the corner of her mouth. Funny, isn't it? She murmurs. When a man defends his throne, he's a hero. When a woman does, she's unnatural. You both stand in silence as the rain thickens. Beyond the window, gray skies fold over ruined towers. I used to dream, she says softly, that I could change the story, that one day, someone would tell it slower, with fewer swords and more understanding. Her gaze meets yours, almost pleading. So here you are. Tell it slower. You nod. She closes her eyes. Good. Then maybe I can rest a little. A faint gust of wind flutters the curtains, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and smoke. When it passes, Margaret is gone. All that remains is the empty chair, and beside it, a single white rose, petals trembling. You walk again. The rain fades behind you, and the corridor changes shape, narrowing, softening, turning into something like a shadowed hall of tapestries. Each thread glows faintly, each scene telling a story. As you brush your fingers across one, it stirs. The air shivers, and you're no longer in England, you're in Italy. The room smells faintly of ink and beeswax. A quill scratches faintly in the background. And before you, seated at a carved wooden desk beneath a window spilling golden light, is Caterina Sforza, the Countess of Forli, the Renaissance woman who terrified even Machiavelli. She looks up from her writing, eyes bright, smile sharp. "Ah," she says, "another ghost of the future come to study the past." You smile, bowing slightly. "They say you were impossible." Katerina laughs. A low, unapologetic sound. "Good. That means they noticed." She gestures to a small chest beside her, filled with bottles of curious liquid. Perfumes, poisons, same ingredients, different purposes. You glance at one labeled Lacrime di Luna. Moon tears. "I made that one on a dare," she says. "It was supposed to make people honest. It mostly made them sleepy." You both share a quiet laugh. Her tone turns reflective. "They called me cruel, but they forget that cruelty was survival. You can't rule a city surrounded by men with knives and not learn to smile at breakfast and suspect your wine by supper." You think of the story, the famous one, the siege of her fortress, when enemies captured her children and threatened to kill them unless she surrendered. "They say you told them to go ahead," you murmur. She looks up sharply, amused. "Oh, I said much worse. But yes, I told them I could make more sons if I wanted." You hesitate. Historians still debate if that's true. "Oh, it's true enough for them to write it down," she says with a grin. Her gaze softens. You see, dear listener, fear has a strange shape. When you've lost everything, you stop trembling. You become calm. She leans back in her chair. "They remember me for defiance. But I wish they'd remember I loved gardens, and painting, and walking barefoot on cool stone floors." Her voice lowers to a whisper. "I loved the scent of basil more than the smell of gunpowder." You can almost smell it, green, sharp, alive. She returns to her writing, her quill moving swiftly. "Tell them," she says, "that I wasn't a monster. I was just awake." And when you blink again, the desk is empty. The ink still wet, the scent of basil lingering in the air. You step backward into the tapestry hall. The threads shimmer again, glowing faintly under your hand. Two queens, two tempests, one of rain, one of fire. Both faded into quiet memory, their edges softened by time. And you feel that familiar, gentle fatigue, not of boredom, but of peace. The kind that comes from realizing how long history really is, and how many lives it has already lived. The corridor hums again. It wants to show you more, and you follow. You step into dusk. Everything here feels hushed, filtered through candle smoke. The sound of wind through tall grass drifts faintly through the stone walls. You're in what looks like a chapel, though stripped bare of gold or glory, just wood, stone, and time. At the altar, her back to you, stands Joan of Navarre, widow of Henry IV of England, accused of witchcraft in her old age. Her gray hair is braided simply, her posture unbowed. She turns slowly when you approach. Her eyes are the clear, unwavering kind that see too much. "They said I bewitched the king," she murmurs. "Imagine thinking love itself must be sorcery." Her laugh is soft, dry, almost affectionate toward her own absurd fate. She brushes her hands along the surface of the altar, as though it's something familiar. "They locked me away, took my lands, but they couldn't take the quiet." You watch her in silence, the flicker of candlelight catching on the thin gold band she still wears. Historians still debate whether I practiced magic, she says with a shrug. But I find that question boring. Everyone practices a little magic, just not with candles and words. Sometimes, it's with patience. You smile faintly, and sometimes, you add, it's with stubbornness. She grins, pleased. Exactly. The wind rises, humming through the cracks in the wall. You see, she says, a queen spends her life learning to be seen, but when the crown is gone, she learns to vanish instead. She looks toward the doorway, where the setting sun bleeds through the wooden beams. That's a kind of freedom too. For a long time, she just stands there, hands folded, face serene, as though the centuries have softened every sorrow into stillness. When she speaks again, her voice is barely a whisper. Tell them I wasn't wicked, just inconvenient. You nod. She smiles, and then fades, the chapel dissolving into mist around her. The mist becomes moonlight, and moonlight becomes marble. You blink, and suddenly you're standing in an echoing courtyard. Long arches, cool air, a scent of pomegranate and iron. There, leaning lazily against a fountain, is Isabella of Castile, the architect of Spain's unification, and the woman who sent Columbus sailing west. She greets you with a calm nod, her expression hard to read. You've come a long way, she says. You study her carefully. History remembers her in layers. Devout, ambitious, unyielding, and controversial. She notices your hesitation and smirks. You're wondering which version of me you'll meet. You nod. She chuckles quietly. That depends on how you listen. She walks slowly around the fountain. They say I prayed too much. Or perhaps I just didn't apologize enough. Her tone sharpens slightly, not angry, but deeply deliberate. They forget I ruled a kingdom built on dust and debt, that I had to turn faith into policy just to keep the borders from collapsing. She dips her hand into the fountain. Ripples shiver outward. Historians still debate whether I was cruel or visionary, but rarely do they ask what it felt like. You tilt your head. And what did it feel like? She looks up at you, eyes tired but fierce, like holding fire with bare hands, and pretending it didn't burn. A silence stretches between you. Finally, she says softly, I believed the world could be remade. I just didn't ask whose world it would be. She looks down, then smiles faintly. Perhaps every queen learns too late that power is not a crown, but a mirror. It shows what you want most, and what you'd rather not see. The fountain gurgles quietly. The air cools. She nods toward the shadows behind her. Tell them I meant well, but also tell them meaning well has never been enough. The wind carries her words away, and once again you are alone. The courtyard empties into the night, leaving only the faint scent of pomegranate and regret. The corridor of history calls again. You walk on. The air ahead feels warmer, tinted with gold, humming with quiet music. You step through a curtain of time and into a hall lined with tapestries that gleam like honey under soft torchlight. The smell of lavender and parchment drifts gently around you. At the far end, seated upon a modest wooden throne, is Anne of Brittany, the twice Queen of France, crowned once beside Charles VIII and again beside Louis XII. Small, dignified, and eternally outnumbered. She's weaving something on a narrow loom, her fingers deft, her attention half with you and half with the thread. You walk softly, she says without looking up. That's good. Threads don't like sudden movement. You bow slightly. I didn't want to interrupt. You already have, she says, smiling faintly. But that's all right. History is full of interruptions. You watch her work. Bright blue silk against pale linen. the pattern slowly forming into what looks like a crown surrounded by vines. "They always talk about my marriages," she says, her tone calm but edged. "Two kings, two crowns, two sets of advisors explaining to me how to behave." She chuckles softly. "It's strange. I'm remembered for being a prize, as though my heart was a treaty written in perfume." She pauses, snips a thread, ties another. "Historians still debate whether I was truly happy, as if happiness were the measure of queenship." You tilt your head. "What was, then?" She looks up, eyes sharp and steady. "Endurance." She gestures toward the loom. "You see this pattern? It's not about beauty. It's about repetition. Strength through rhythm. That's how women survive in courts made of marble, by turning monotony into armor." You notice her hands trembling slightly from years of delicate work. She smiles faintly, noticing you noticing. "My body belonged to kings," she says softly. "But my patience, that was mine alone." She leans back, examining her half-finished tapestry. "They say I restored Brittany's pride. I like that story, but I think I just wanted a place that didn't forget its own songs." You nod slowly, imagining her standing on the windy coast of Brittany, the waves crashing against the cliffs, her crown glinting like a seashell caught in sunlight. She glances up at you, eyes full of quiet humor. "Tell your listeners this. If you want to understand a queen, watch how she handles silence." Her fingers move again, the loom whispering in rhythm with her words. "Now go," she says softly. "I have a pattern to finish. And you, I think, have more ghosts to meet." You bow deeply. The scent of lavender follows you out, twining around your thoughts. The corridor grows darker now, not with fear, but with age. The torch is thin, replaced by candlelight that flickers uncertainly against damp stone. You hear the echo of dripping water, the whisper of fabric, the faint hum of a hymn sung far away. And then, through the shadow, she appears, Eleanor of Aquitaine, cloaked in gold and shadow, her gaze both regal and entirely human. She's older now, past the youth of troubadours and rebellion, but her presence still hums with command. "So," she says, "you finally made it to me." You smile faintly. "How could I not?" She laughs softly. "You'd be surprised how often people forget." You take a slow step closer. Her crown sits loosely on her head, as though it's just a decoration, not an obligation. "I've been called everything," she says. "Temptress, traitor, patron, saint. They wrote songs about me before they ever bothered to ask if I could sing." You catch her tone, dry, almost playful. "They remember my beauty," she says, "but not my boredom." You blink. "Boredom?" "Of course," she says. "Imagine a world where your worth is measured by whose arm you stand beside. I ruled half of France and England, and still I had to pretend embroidery was my greatest triumph." She glances up at you, a spark of mischief in her eyes. "I once joined a crusade, dressed like a knight. You can imagine how the chroniclers handled that." You grin. "Historians still debate whether you really wore armor." "Oh, I wore it," she says, smirking. "They just didn't like how well it fit." The candlelight dances across her face. Lines of wisdom, edges of defiance softened by time. "People say I was dangerous," she continues. "Maybe I was, but I never wanted thrones. I wanted choice." Her voice lowers, threaded with melancholy. "Every queen learns that crowns are cages disguised as halos. The trick is to decorate the bars." She gestures faintly toward a carved wooden chair behind her. "They locked me away for years, my own husband, Henry. Thought I was too clever by half." You whisper, "And were you?" Her smile widens. "Always." A long silence passes between you, filled only by the soft breathing of the candles. Then she says quietly, "Tell them I lived too long, but not long enough to be free." She closes her eyes briefly, perhaps seeing the gardens of Aquitaine, the troubadours who sang for her, the sons she both raised and buried. When she opens them again, the room feels lighter, the air easier to breathe. "Now go," she says gently. "The world is waiting, and I've had enough company for 1 century." As you turn, you hear her murmur, barely audible, "Still, it's nice to be remembered slowly." The words follow you down the hall like a blessing. You walk into quiet, so quiet it feels like velvet. The corridor seems endless now. Not dark, just softly lit, like candlelight seen through eyelids. Your footsteps sound muffled, as though the floor itself is tired of history's weight. Then you hear music, not royal or grand, but something simple. A melody played on a harp, each note fading into the next like rain on glass. You follow it, and there she is, Mary, Queen of Scots, sitting near a window, her red gold hair loose around her shoulders, her hands moving gracefully across harp strings. She glances up when you enter. "You're late," she says, half smiling. "Sorry," you say. "You've had quite a few queens ahead of you." She laughs, soft, musical, a little sad. "Yes, I imagine I'm hard to follow and harder to forget." You sit beside her as she plays. The melody is slow, hypnotic. "Do you know," she says, "they remember me as tragedy, the doomed queen, the pretty one who lost her head." Her fingers pause briefly on the strings. "But I was more than that. I was stubborn. I was clever. I wrote poetry in 3 languages and learned to flirt in 4. You can't help but smile. They say I trusted too easily," she continues. "But I think I just wanted to believe the world wasn't always scheming." Her tone turns faintly teasing. "Historians still debate whether I really plotted against Elizabeth. But I like that they're still talking about me at all." The harp resumes, a lullaby in slow motion. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" she says quietly. "Waiting. 13 years in one room. A queen measured by the shadows of her walls." You listen, the rhythm of her music blending with your heartbeat. "I used to count dust motes," she murmurs, "each one a tiny sun. I thought if I stared long enough, maybe they'd tell me what freedom felt like." She laughs gently, shaking her head. "I even kept a bird once, a sparrow. I envied it for being small enough to slip through a window." The music fades. Silence returns. "Do you hate her?" you ask quietly. She tilts her head. "Elizabeth." You nod. "No," she says after a moment. "How could I? We were mirrors. She ruled her loneliness in public. I ruled mine in private." The wind moves through the open window, lifting the curtain like a sigh. "I suppose I died beautifully," she says at last. "And maybe that's what people remember. But I wish they'd remember that I lived beautifully too." Her gaze drifts toward the horizon. "Tell them I was not just a story, I was a song." You watch her for a long moment as she returns to her harp, fingers tracing one last soft chord that hangs in the air like breath before sleep. When it fades, she's gone. Only the sound of wind remains. You stand, and for a moment you imagine you can still hear her voice. Steady, proud, endlessly human, echoing through the centuries. Then, quietly, you move on. You walk now through a passage that feels neither alive nor dead. Like history itself has slowed down to exhale. The walls are pale, the floor smooth and cool beneath your shoes. Somewhere above, a dove coos lazily, the sound floating like dust in sunbeams. You step into a courtyard, and there she is, Isabella of Castile, her figure outlined against the pale Spanish dawn. She stands with her hands clasped neatly before her, her crown modest, her expression unreadable. Ah, she says softly, not turning. You've come to ask about the myths. You pause. The myths. Yes. She turns to you now, her eyes sharp but kind. That I was ruthless. That I was holy. That I was both. You blink because, well, she's not wrong. History likes its queens in neat boxes, she says, walking slowly along the stone path. Saint or sinner, lover or ruler, never both. You fall into step beside her. The air smells faintly of oranges and candle wax. I did what I had to, she continues, voice steady. I united a kingdom that was splintered by pride. I signed papers that carried oceans in their ink. She pauses near a fountain, watching the ripples play across the surface. And I made mistakes, big ones. But tell me, she says, glancing at you, what ruler hasn't? You think about that for a moment. She leans slightly over the fountain, her reflection trembling in the water. They say I drove out those who didn't believe as I did, that I burned books, that I crowned explorers whose sails would scar the world. Her tone doesn't flinch. They're right. Silence lingers between you. Not heavy, just honest. But they forget, she continues quietly, that I also opened schools for girls, that I read until my eyes burned, that I ruled beside my husband, but never beneath him. She straightens, her reflection stretching tall. Historians still debate whether I was cruel or merely certain. But certainty, she adds, is a dangerous kind of love. You nod slowly. Do you regret it? She looks out toward the horizon, the light gold and thin, almost hesitant. Regret is for those who have time to fix what's done, she says. Queens rarely do. Her voice softens. But I sometimes dream of the sea, of ships sailing home instead of away. The courtyard grows quiet again, except for the gentle splash of the fountain. She turns to you, her eyes like candlelight reflected in glass. Tell your listeners, she says, that history isn't a confession. It's a mirror. Look long enough, and you'll see yourself staring back. And with that, she fades. Not vanishing, exactly, but dissolving like morning mist, leaving only the scent of oranges and the faint hum of prayer. You walk on. The path narrows, lined with tapestries that shimmer faintly in candlelight, each one depicting a different queen, a different century. Their faces blur together, their crowns melting into one long golden thread. At the end of the corridor stands another door, carved with ivy and stars. When you push it open, you're greeted by the soft creak of wood, the smell of ink and parchment, and the rhythmic scratching of a quill. At a desk cluttered with scrolls sits Christine de Pizan, one of Europe's first female historians. Not a queen, but a recorder of them. She doesn't look up as you enter. You're late, she murmurs, dipping her quill. You're not a queen, you say. No, she says, without offense. But I built a city of them. You look closer. The parchment before her shows miniature towers, each inscribed with names. Joan, Blanche, Margaret, Philippa. It's called the City of Ladies, she says softly. A fortress of words for women who deserved better walls. You move closer, watching her ink shimmer under candlelight. Why did you build it? She finally looks up, her eyes both tired and bright. Because someone had to. Her hand moves again, deliberate and steady. The world was busy calling us weak. I was busy writing evidence. You smile faintly. Historians still debate whether your book was taken seriously. Christine snorts softly. They debated that while reading it. You both laugh quietly, the sound small and comfortable. She sets her quill down. You've met queens who ruled. I wrote for those who couldn't, and for those who didn't know they already were. You glance at her parchment. A city skyline of feminine names, towers built from ink and defiance. You're the reason we remember them, you say quietly. She shrugs gently. Maybe, or maybe they remember themselves through me. Either way, she smiles. It's a fine way to be forgotten. You linger a moment longer, watching the soft glow of her work, the words spreading like roots through time. Then she waves you off with a kind smile. Go, she says. You have more shadows to meet. And so you do. The world outside her study feels different now. Softer, older, tinged with candle smoke and echoes of prayer. You pass beneath a stone archway into a courtyard half wild with ivy. A single lantern glows by a bench, and seated there, wrapped in furs, staring at the stars, is Catherine de Medici. She doesn't look up when you arrive. Careful, she murmurs. I'm thinking dangerous thoughts. You hesitate. Should I come back later? No, she says, gesturing lazily. Just don't interrupt if the stars start answering. You sit beside her. The night is crisp, the air laced with the faint sweetness of crushed herbs. I'm told I was wicked, she says after a moment. Poison rings, secret plots, hidden daggers. You raise an eyebrow. Were you? She smiles thinly. No more than the men who wrote those stories. A cricket chirps nearby. The silence between you feels companionable, almost domestic. They call me the Serpent Queen, she continues. But what else should one be, surrounded by lions? Her gaze turns skyward, following the slow drift of clouds. Historians still debate whether I caused the massacre. But tell me, if I had that much power, why did I spend my life keeping my sons alive instead of myself? You can hear the quiet pain buried under her sarcasm, the exhaustion of a woman whose every move became rumor. I loved France, she says softly, even when it tore itself apart. I just didn't realize love could be such a violent tutor. You glance at her, seeing the shadows beneath her eyes, the fragile strength in her posture. Do you ever wish you'd lived differently? She exhales slowly. No, she says, but I wish I'd lived quieter. She smiles faintly, turning to you. You understand? Power hums in your bones, but it never lets you sleep. A long pause. The stars above shimmer like candle flames. Then, in a softer tone, she adds, if your listeners are still awake, tell them to envy peasants for their peace, not queens for their crowns. You chuckle quietly. Noted. She stands, brushing dust from her cloak. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have ghosts to manage. She starts to leave, but then glances back. And one more thing, she adds. Don't believe everything written about me. Her smile widens, sharp and knowing. But don't dismiss it all either. Half of it's true. She vanishes into the shadows, her laughter faint but lingering, like smoke curling into starlight. You sit for a while longer beneath the wide French sky, feeling the stillness of the garden, the slow turning of centuries above you. Somewhere, a church bell tolls, slow, even, almost like a heartbeat. The night seems endless, but you feel it shifting, guiding you toward the final steps of your journey, toward the last queens waiting patiently in the dark. You walk again, softly now, as though each step risks waking something ancient. The moon hovers low, pale and round, and the night air smells faintly of rain and lavender. In the distance, you hear slow, rhythmic footsteps, deliberate, heavy and regal. A tall figure emerges through the mist. A woman in a long blue gown, her hair braided with pearls, her posture impossibly straight. Mary of Scotland walks as if time still owes her an apology. She turns when she senses you. Her eyes, that calm, storm-gray color, hold both grace and fatigue. You're late, she says softly. But then again, so was my freedom. You smile gently. You waited a long time. Too long, she says, looking out toward the unseen horizon. Waiting became my occupation. Waiting to rule. Waiting to flee. Waiting for the mercy of men who mistook letters for rebellion. She sits on a fallen stone, smoothing her gown. They called me reckless, romantic, naive. A small laugh escapes her lips, quiet, breathy. Imagine, a queen of nations scolded like a child for trusting her own heart. You stand beside her, the air shimmering faintly around the hem of her dress. Historians still debate whether you plotted Elizabeth's death. You murmur. She smiles without warmth. Debate away. I wrote so many letters, even I lost track of which were prayers and which were plans. A long pause. Then she says, almost wistfully, we women were taught to write, but not to win. The wind stirs her hair. She tucks a loose strand behind her ear with the delicacy of habit. Elizabeth had her throne, she continues. I had my silence. We were both prisoners. Really, hers was made of duty, mine of stone. The night deepens around you, soft as velvet. They remember me for my execution, she says after a moment. The crimson gown, the trembling hand. She tilts her head. But they forget I was laughing that morning. I told my ladies I was going to meet a better husband. You chuckle quietly, surprised. Yes, she says with a faint smirk. Even queens find comfort in gallows humor. Her gaze drifts upward again. Do you know what I miss most? She asks. The sound of a harp, that gentle, tumbling rhythm. It felt like home, even when home had forgotten me. You both fall silent, listening. And perhaps, faintly, you hear it, a harp note plucked by memory itself. She rises gracefully, brushing dew from her skirts. Tell your listeners this, she says. The past isn't gone. It's just tired of being misunderstood. Then she smiles, soft and human now, not royal, and walks away into the mist, leaving the faint scent of rain behind. You follow the fading notes of that imagined harp through a narrow archway. Stone walls give way to warmth. Flickering firelight, tapestries heavy with gold thread. A tall mirror stands before you, framed in twisted vines and crowned with a single, carved rose. You approach slowly, and there she is, Elizabeth I, standing not in flesh but in reflection. Her red hair gleams like sunset, her collar a froth of lace and authority. She gazes at you through the mirror, or maybe past you, eyes sharp enough to slice centuries. Ah, she says, her voice smooth. Another dreamer come to judge me. You shake your head. Not judge, just listen. Her smile curves slightly. Then you'll be the first. You step closer, and she mirrors you. Exact, precise, unsettling. They think I was lonely, she says, that I died whispering to ghosts in an empty palace. She folds her hands neatly. But they forget. Solitude isn't the same as sadness. I chose to stand alone. Men called it vanity. I called it survival. Her voice dips lower. Historians still debate whether I truly loved anyone. But that question says more about them than about me. You feel the mirror pulse faintly. Not literally, but emotionally. Like her words have weight. I ruled a kingdom that doubted a woman could rule at all, she says. So I became something no one could love, a symbol instead of a soul. The firelight flickers, catching her reflection in gold. She leans forward, her tone almost conspiratorial. Do you know the worst part of being immortalized? You shake your head. They stop listening for your heartbeat. For a moment, the room seems to breathe with her. Slow, weary, proud. I was called the Virgin Queen, she says. But perhaps I was simply the queen who couldn't belong to anyone, not even herself. Her reflection wavers, the light dimming. Still, she adds with a faint smirk, I'd rather be feared by history than forgotten by it. And as the mirror fades, you realize she's gone. But her eyes remain, imprinted faintly in the glass, as if watching the centuries go by. You exhale slowly. The air feels different now, thicker, filled with centuries of words, regrets, and laughter that history never recorded. The corridor stretches on before you, lined with echoes of queens, each one waiting still, not for power, but for peace. The flicker of torches becomes softer, warmer, a glow leading you toward something final, something like rest. You step through the last archway, and the world opens, wide, golden, and endlessly still. A twilight meadow stretches before you, dotted with wildflowers that glow faintly as the wind passes through them. The sky above hums in slow colors, blue fading to silver, silver melting into soft rose. And there, seated in a half-circle, are all the queens you've met. Their gowns ripple faintly like candle flames, their faces calm, patient, and strangely human. Isabella, Eleanor, Matilda, Margaret, Mary, Elizabeth, and dozens more, queens forgotten by history but remembered here, in this quiet between worlds. You approach slowly. They smile. No crowns now, only faces lit by dusk. You've walked far, one of them says. You nod. Did you find what you were looking for? Another asks. You hesitate. Maybe not answers, but understanding. A ripple of soft laughter moves through the circle. Kind, knowing. That's all history ever offers, says one. The rest is imagination. The air hums gently, the grass brushing against your ankles. A small bird lands on a nearby stone, its feathers gold in the fading light. Catherine de' Medici raises her cup, not of wine but water. To those who waited, she says softly. Isabella smiles faintly. To those who ruled quietly. And Mary, eyes soft and far away, whispers. To those who were remembered wrongly, but remembered still. The toast passes through the air like a sigh. You close your eyes. The sound of wind and rustling silk blends into a slow, rhythmic hush, a lullaby made of centuries. The queens begin to fade, one by one, their forms dissolving like breath on glass. But their voices linger, overlapping, gentle, almost indistinguishable. Sleep, one murmurs. Rest, says another. Dream, whispers a third. You lie back in the grass, eyes half closed, the sky soft above you. The last thing you hear is Elizabeth's voice. Quiet, wry, still somehow regal. You probably won't make it through this story awake, and that's the point. And then only stillness. The wind slows, the light dims, history exhales. The meadow folds itself into silence, and sleep comes slow, certain, and kind.